Tonight's story comes from a forest ranger assigned to a wilderness outpost so remote it doesn't even appear on most maps. It was supposed to be a routine overnight shift. Equipment checks, radio logs, and silence broken only by wind and distant wildlife. But before midnight, small details began to feel wrong. An extra boot print near the door. A chair that was still warm. A logbook entry written during hours. No one was scheduled to be there. What follows is a first-person account of a single shift that unraveled into something far more disturbing. No monsters. No legends passed down for campfire scares. Just procedures, isolation, and the creeping realization that someone, or something, was sharing the outpost, unseen and uninvited. This is my most terrifying shift. Unseen occupant in a wilderness outpost. A true scary story told from the perspective of the ranger who lived through it. Listen closely. In places like this, the quiet is never empty. My name is Daniel Rowe. I am a records analyst contracted by a regional interagency task group that handles unresolved missing persons cases deemed inactive by local authorities. My role is not investigative in the traditional sense. I do not interview witnesses or walk search grids. I am assigned to files, paper, scanned reports, microfilm, and archival recordings, tasked with identifying patterns that were missed or dismissed at the time. On the morning this incident began, I was formally assigned a backlog spanning more than 60 years of disappearances linked, by a thin and largely ignored thread, to a single forest road that no longer appears on modern maps. The assignment came through at 08:12 a.m. via a secure internal server. The file designation was unremarkable, but the volume was not. 37 cases across multiple decades, jurisdictions and agencies, all tagged with an outdated routing code, referencing an access road labeled simply as F12 Spur. There was no accompanying explanation. Roads are frequently decommissioned, renamed, or absorbed into wilderness areas, and unresolved cases often share geographic overlap without deeper meaning. That was my assumption when I opened the first file. The earliest case dated back to 1954. A forestry technician failed to report back after a routine inspection. The final log entry placed him approximately 3 miles past the F12 junction. There was no follow-up documentation explaining where that junction was. Only a note that the road was no longer maintained. The technician's vehicle was found parked neatly along a gravel turnout. The keys were missing. There were no signs of struggle. This description repeated itself with unsettling consistency as I progressed through the files. By mid-morning, I had cataloged 7 cases. Different decades. Different victims. Similar language. The same phrasing appeared again and again in the reports: no sign of distress. Vehicle secured, personal effects left behind. In several instances, search teams reported that the road terminated sooner than expected, or that it did not align with survey maps. One report from the late 1970s included a hand-drawn sketch of the road's supposed route, overlaid with a typed note stating that aerial reconnaissance failed to locate it. At 11:03 a.m., I accessed a digitized map archive to cross-reference historical Forest Service layouts. The road appeared on maps from the 1940s through the early 1960s, then vanished entirely. It was not marked as closed or reclaimed. It was simply gone, replaced by an uninterrupted stretch of green. Modern satellite imagery showed dense, mature forest where the road should have been, but tree growth patterns suggested something else. The canopy line was subtly uneven, forming a narrow corridor that did not match natural regrowth. I should have stopped there. Pattern recognition does not require field confirmation. My task was to flag anomalies, not pursue them. But the assignment notes included a single sentence at the end of the file summary. Field verification authorized if deemed necessary. That authorization was rarely granted. It implied that someone else had noticed what I was noticing. At 12:17 p.m., I requested access to a government vehicle and sent out a standard issue GPS unit, audio recorder, and camera. The forest was less than an hour's drive from the regional office. I told myself I would locate the approximate area, confirm that the road no longer existed, and return with updated documentation. That was the extent of my plan. The drive was uneventful. The main highway transitioned into a two-lane state road, then into a narrower forest road. Cell reception degraded gradually, not abruptly. The GPS continued to function, though it no longer displayed road names, only contour lines and coordinates. At 1:41 p.m., I reached the point where the archived maps indicated the F12 junction should have been. There was nothing there. No signpost. No clearing. Just trees pressing close to the asphalt, their branches forming a partial canopy overhead. I parked on the shoulder and stepped out. The forest was quiet in a way that felt procedural rather than peaceful. No wind, no insects. The silence had structure, like a room waiting to be occupied. I activated the audio recorder out of habit and noted the time and location. As I scanned the tree line, I noticed a subtle break in the undergrowth directly opposite the road. Not a trail, but a depression, as if something long and straight had once pressed the earth down and never fully released it. I followed it on foot. The ground dipped gently, and after less than 50 yards, the trees parted just enough to reveal gravel. Old gravel, embedded deep into the soil, darkened with age, but unmistakable. A road, narrower than modern standards, with no shoulder and no visible maintenance, but intact. My GPS did not register it. The device showed me standing in the middle of undeveloped forest. I documented the location with photographs and spoke my observations aloud for the recorder. The road extended forward in a straight line, vanishing into shadow. It did not curve to accommodate terrain. It did not rise or fall naturally. It cut through the forest with quiet indifference, as if the land had been instructed to move aside. At 2:06 p.m., I made the decision that would later be scrutinized by people who were not there. I stepped onto the road. The air felt cooler immediately, not by much, but enough to register. The forest on either side seemed denser now, the trees closer together, their trunks aligned in a way that suggested planning rather than growth. I walked slowly, counting my steps, noting landmarks. After 10 minutes, I stopped and turned around. The road behind me looked the same as it had when I entered it, but the opening back to the main road was gone, not obscured, not hidden, gone. The gravel continued uninterrupted into the forest in both directions. I told myself that perspective can shift in unfamiliar terrain. I advanced another 100 yards and checked my GPS again. The screen flickered briefly before returning to the same static coordinates. The compass needle spun once, then settled, pointing straight ahead. At 2:34 p.m., I noticed the first vehicle. It was parked along the side of the road, partially sunken into the gravel. An older model sedan, paint faded, tires long since deflated. Moss had begun to creep up the doors. The license plate was from the early 1980s. The driver's side door was closed. The windows were intact. Inside, on the passenger seat, lay a folded map. I did not touch it. I photographed it and moved on. More vehicles followed. Not clustered, but spaced evenly, as if parked intentionally at intervals. A pickup truck from the 1960s. A station wagon. A compact car I recognized from one of the case files. None showed signs of damage. None appeared to have been abandoned in haste. Each one felt paused rather than left behind. The light began to change around 3:15 p.m. Not dimming. Exactly, but flattening, as if the shadows had lost depth. I checked my watch repeatedly. Time continued to pass normally. My breathing sounded louder than it should have. Every footstep echoed slightly, though the road's surface should have absorbed sound. At 3:42 p.m., I heard a noise ahead of me. It was not a voice. It was the sound of movement, measured and unhurried, coming from somewhere beyond the reach of the road's straight line. I stopped walking. The sound continued. Gravel shifting under weight. One step, then another. Approaching but never closer. I called out, identified myself, and stated my purpose. My voice felt thin, stretched too far. The sound stopped. I did not wait for it to resume. I turned and began walking back the way I believed I had come. The road did not change. The vehicles did not reappear in the same order. My GPS remained fixed. At 4:18 p.m., I realized I had been walking for over an hour, without reaching the forest opening. The audio recorder was still running. I spoke into it, steady and formal, documenting everything I could. The silence listened. At 4:53 p.m., the sound of footsteps returned, this time behind me. They matched my pace exactly. I did not turn around. I continued forward because stopping felt worse than moving. The sound behind me remained perfectly synchronized with my own steps, gravel responding to weight that mirrored mine without variation. When I slowed, it slowed. When I stopped, it stopped. There was no breath, no stumble, no irregularity that would suggest another human body reacting independently. It was imitation stripped of effort. I reminded myself to document. At 5:01 p.m., I spoke clearly into the recorder, noting auditory mimicry consistent with perceived pursuit, though no visual confirmation was present. Saying it aloud steadied me. Professional language has a way of placing distance between a situation and the person trapped inside it. I forced myself to turn. The road behind me was empty. It stretched straight and narrow, gravel unbroken, forest pressing in on both sides with identical density. No vehicles, no footprints, no movement. The silence returned immediately, thick enough to register as pressure. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for something to contradict what my eyes were telling me. Nothing did. When I resumed walking, the footsteps did not return. By 5:26 p.m., the light had shifted again. The sky above the road was still visible through gaps in the canopy, but it no longer suggested late afternoon. There was no warmth in it, no sense of angle or direction. It was light without a source, evenly distributed, as if time had stalled between moments. I checked my watch. It was still advancing. I felt hunger, thirst, fatigue. My body insisted that the day was moving forward, even if the world around me disagreed. Another vehicle appeared ahead of me, this one different from the others. A Forest Service truck, older model, white paint flaking off in sheets. The insignia on the door was barely legible but familiar. I recognized the unit number from one of the files. This truck belonged to a ranger reported missing in 1992. According to the case notes, he had radioed in confusion about a road that would not end. The driver's side door was open. I approached slowly, every instinct warning me against closing the distance. But the alternative, walking past without looking, felt like a greater violation. Inside the cab, the interior was intact. No signs of struggle. The radio unit was still mounted to the dash. I turned it on. Static burst from the speaker, loud enough to make me flinch. I adjusted the volume, cycling through channels out of habit rather than hope. At first, there was nothing but interference. Then, faintly, a voice. It was distorted, stretched thin by decades of decay and signal loss, but the cadence was unmistakable. A man speaking carefully, as if choosing words under stress. He was repeating a location description, over and over, correcting himself each time. The coordinates never changed, but his confidence did. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp click, followed by silence. I turned the radio off. I did not check the back of the truck. I knew what I would find if I did. Instead, I stepped away and continued down the road, documenting the encounter aloud. My voice shook despite my efforts to control it. The recorder captured everything, including the moments where I stopped speaking, because there was nothing left to say that felt true. At 6:04 p.m., the forest began to change. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have been obvious if I had not been watching for it. The trees grew closer together, their branches arching higher over the road. The undergrowth thinned, replaced by bare earth that sloped gently away from the gravel. The road itself appeared smoother here, less eroded, as if maintained by something that understood its purpose, but not its origin. I became aware, gradually, that I could no longer hear my own footsteps clearly. The gravel still shifted beneath my boots, but the sound was muted, absorbed almost immediately. The world felt padded, insulated from consequence. When I spoke, my voice did not echo. It simply stopped, as if cut off at a fixed distance. That was when I realized I could hear breathing. It was not close. It was not far. It existed everywhere at once. A low, steady intake and release that blended with the ambient silence until I focused on it. Once I did, I could not stop hearing it. It did not change when I stopped walking. It did not change when I moved faster. It was not following me. It was part of the road. I told myself this was stress-induced auditory distortion, isolation fatigue, and prolonged exposure to unfamiliar stimuli can produce convincing sensory artifacts. I repeated that explanation internally until the words lost meaning. At 6:37 p.m., I found the first personal item. A wristwatch lay on the gravel near the edge of the road. The glass was cracked, but the hands still moved. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to a college student who disappeared in 2008 while driving home from a camping trip. The watch had been listed among the items he was wearing when last seen. It should have been on his wrist. I did not pick it up. I photographed it and moved on. More items appeared as I walked. A shoe, a set of keys, a folded jacket placed neatly on a low branch, as if set aside deliberately. None of them showed signs of damage consistent with violence or haste. They felt curated, arranged with care rather than discarded. The road narrowed further. At 7:11 p.m., I reached a section where the gravel gave way to compacted dirt. The forest closed in until the trees were nearly flush with the road's edges. I became acutely aware of the space behind me again, not because I heard anything, but because the absence of sound felt intentional. I resisted the urge to turn. I asked, out loud, what it wanted. The question slipped out before I could stop it. It felt foolish the moment it left my mouth, a human instinct to assign agency where none should exist. The forest did not respond. The breathing continued, unchanged. Then the road ahead shifted. It did not bend. It did not curve. It simply ended, abruptly, at a wall of trees so dense they appeared fused together. The surface of the road pressed into the roots, stopping short as if cut off mid-thought. There was no clearing, no continuation, no space to step through. I stood there staring, trying to reconcile the impossibility of what I was seeing. Roads do not end like that. They erode. They fade. They are reclaimed slowly, imperfectly. This was different. This was termination. Behind me, the breathing grew louder. I turned. The road was gone. Not behind me, beneath me. The ground where gravel had been moments before was now forest floor, soft with needles and soil. The trees stood where the road should have been, identical to the ones ahead. I was standing in a corridor that no longer existed, held in place by memory alone. My GPS finally changed. The screen flickered, then displayed coordinates I did not recognize. They did not correspond to any known grid system I was familiar with. The compass needle spun wildly, then snapped into alignment, pointing directly at me. At 7:46 p.m., the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I stood still because the alternative was to move without direction, and that felt like consent. The forest around me no longer suggested as I could navigate. It felt like a diagram that had been folded incorrectly, edges overlapping where they should not. When I shifted my weight, the ground responded softly, absorbing the motion without echo or resistance. The absence of sound was so complete that my own heartbeat felt intrusive. At 7:49 p.m., I spoke again, quietly, into the recorder. I stated my name, my role, and the last confirmed time. My voice sounded distant to my own ears, as if traveling through a medium thicker than air. I noted the disappearance of the road, the alteration of terrain, and the anomalous GPS behavior. I avoided speculation. I focused on observation. That discipline was all I had left. I attempted to retrace my steps using memory rather than landmarks. After 10 paces, the trees ahead of me separated just enough to suggest passage. It was not a trail. It was an allowance. I took it. The forest corridor extended forward, in a straight line, no wider than the road had been, bordered by trees that stood unnaturally upright. Their branches did not cross the space above me. The canopy remained open, revealing a sky that had finally darkened into something recognizable as evening. Stars were visible, but they did not match any configuration I knew. They felt arranged rather than distant. As I walked, the breathing returned. It was closer now, no longer ambient. It rose and fell with a rhythm that did not match mine. I could feel it more than hear it. A pressure against the back of my neck, like standing near a large animal just outside the range of sight. I kept my eyes forward. I did not turn. I had learned that the road responded to attention. At 8:14 p.m., the corridor opened into a clearing. The vehicles were all there. Every car, truck, and van I had seen along the road was arranged in a wide circle, headlights facing inward, engines long dead. The clearing itself was unnaturally level, the forest retreating just enough to accommodate the assembly. In the center stood a single wooden post, weathered and splintered, with no signage attached. People stood beside the vehicles. They were not moving. They were not facing me. Each stood with their back to the clearing's center, hands at their sides, posture neutral. They did not appear injured. They did not appear distressed. They appeared paused. I recognized several of them immediately. Faces from case files. Photographs taken decades apart. now present together in the same space, unchanged by time. Clothing styles varied, but their condition did not. No aging, no decay. They were preserved impressions of moments that never concluded. I stopped at the edge of the clearing. The breathing ceased the instant I did. One of the figures moved. It was a small motion, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. A shift of weight, a tilt of the head. Then another figure did the same. The movement spread slowly around the circle, not synchronized, but deliberate, as if something were testing responsiveness. I felt a pull then, not physical, but conceptual. An urge to step forward, to take a place among them, to align myself with the pattern that had been waiting. I refused. I stated, out loud, that I was leaving. I announced my intent to return to the main road, to exit the forest, to document the site with external authorities. The words felt ceremonial, less like a plan and more like a declaration of principle. The figures turned. They did not turn all the way, only enough to show profile. Their faces were calm. Their eyes were open. They were looking past me, not at me, focused on something behind my shoulder. I did not look. The GPS vibrated in my hand. The screen updated again, this time displaying coordinates that were familiar. Latitudes and longitudes consistent with the region I knew. The compass needle stabilized, pointing to my left. For the first time since entering the road, the device behaved as it should have. I took one step in the indicated direction. The clearing shuddered. Not violently, not dramatically. It was more like a collective adjustment, as if the environment were recalibrating a variable it had not anticipated. The figures stiffened. The vehicle's headlights flickered. Though no power source remained, the wooden post in the center cracked down the middle with a sharp, final sound. I ran. I did not follow the corridor. I did not follow any visible path. I ran in the direction the GPS indicated, pushing through undergrowth that resisted me in ways the road never had. Branches snagged my clothing. Roots caught my boots. The forest felt suddenly alive with consequence, each movement answered by sound and friction. Behind me, something moved quickly. It no longer matched my pace. It exceeded it. I did not turn. I focused on forward motion, on breath, on the weight of my body as proof that I still occupied it. The breathing grew ragged, uneven, no longer controlled. It sounded frustrated. At 8:37 p.m., I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto asphalt. I collapsed onto the shoulder of the state road, lungs burning, hands shaking uncontrollably. The forest behind me was silent, dark, and unremarkable. No corridor, no clearing. No indication that anything had ever existed beyond the tree line. A passing vehicle stopped. The driver asked if I was injured. I told him I had gotten lost. He offered to call for help. I accepted. Authorities arrived within 30 minutes. I gave a statement that omitted nothing and explained nothing beyond what I could support with evidence. Search teams returned to the location before midnight. They found no road, no vehicles, no clearing. Only forest consistent with satellite imagery and land surveys. My equipment was intact. The audio recorder contained everything I had spoken, including the sounds I could not explain. The GPS unit retained the anomalous coordinate logs. Both were confiscated for review. I was released at 11:58 p.m. The assignment was at 12:03 a.m., reclassified as resolved due to clerical error. The files referencing F-12 Spur were removed from the archive. My access credentials were downgraded the following morning. I have not returned to that forest. Sometimes when I review old maps for unrelated cases, I find a faint line where no road should be. It never appears twice in the same place. It never stays long enough to be captured. And when I notice it, I feel an immediate and overwhelming sense that I have been noticed in return. My name is Samuel Price. I am employed as a records and evidence catalog for a regional search and recovery division that supports multiple law enforcement and park services across 3 counties. My role is not investigative in nature. I do not interview families, search terrain, or determine causes. I receive objects after all of that has already failed. Wallets, phones, notebooks, boots, watches, cameras, backpacks, scraps of clothing, and sometimes items that never make sense in context. I document them, photograph them, log their condition, and store them in climate-controlled evidence rooms. I am trained to observe without interpretation. That distance is part of the job. It is also the reason I noticed what happened next. The building I work in is a renovated municipal archive constructed in the late 1970s. It is windowless on the lower floors and reinforced to preserve temperature and humidity. The evidence vault occupies the sublevel. Motion sensors, sealed access logs, and cameras monitor every corridor. I am usually alone. My shift begins at 7:00 a.m. and ends at 7:00 p.m. and most days pass without incident. On the morning this happened, I arrived early due to a backlog of items recovered during a coordinated wilderness search the previous week. 6 missing persons cases had been closed as unresolved within 48 hours of each other. The recovered property had arrived overnight in sealed containers. I introduced myself to the duty supervisor, signed the access ledger, and descended to the vault with my coffee still untouched. The containers were already staged on the intake tables. Each bore a red tag indicating recovery without subject. I began as trained, opening one container at a time, documenting contents in strict order. A nylon daypack from case 11204 contained a rain jacket, trail map, protein bar wrappers, a compass, and a paperback novel with dog-eared pages. A camera bag from case 11209 held a digital camera, spare batteries, and an SD card that had already been cloned by forensics. Everything was routine, methodical, predictable. I noticed the first inconsistency just after 9:30 a.m. while cataloging a leather wristwatch recovered near a dry creek bed. The watch had stopped at 2:14. I logged the time, photographed the face, and placed it in a numbered evidence tray. When I returned to the tray moments later to affix the barcode label, the hands indicated 217. I assumed I had misread it. I reset the documentation, checked the camera timestamp, and continued. By late morning, the vault had taken on its familiar quiet. The HVAC hum was constant, and the fluorescent lights cast a neutral tone over everything. I took a short break at 12:05 p.m., leaving the vault secured. When I returned at 12:18 p.m., nothing appeared disturbed. Access logs showed no entries. Cameras recorded no motion. I resumed work on a box of personal effects recovered from a campsite, a metal mog, a folding knife, a notebook with weather notes, and a small plastic dinosaur figurine. The figurine was unusual but not unheard of. People carry comforts. I logged it as found. At 1:02 p.m., I reached for the figurine to photograph it from a different angle. It was no longer in the tray. I searched the table surface, the floor, and adjacent trays. It was not misplaced. After a moment of confusion, I located it in a different tray across the table, positioned upright, beside a set of car keys from another case. There was no reason for it to be there. I checked the tray numbers. They were correct. I checked the cameras. No footage showed movement. I corrected the placement, noting the anomaly, privately rather than in the official record. From that point forward, I paid closer attention. At 20:10 p.m., a pair of hiking boots that had been logged side by side were now angled inward, toes nearly touching. At 3:00 p.m., a spiral notebook I had closed lay open to a page containing a list of trail mile markers written in pencil. I distinctly remembered closing it. I began to feel the strain of long hours and assumed fatigue. Still, I made a deliberate effort to document each item's position before moving on. At 40:12 p.m., the pattern became undeniable. I had arranged 5 recovered items from unrelated cases on a table for final photography. The wristwatch, the dinosaur figurine, a cracked smartphone, a single glove, and a silver keychain shaped like a pine tree. I stepped away for less than 2 minutes to retrieve fresh gloves from the supply cabinet. When I returned, the items had been rearranged, not scattered, aligned. The watch lay at the center. The other items radiated outward in a loose arc. The phone screen faced upward. The glove was folded. The figurine stood at attention. My first response was procedural. I checked for unauthorized access. The logs showed none. The cameras showed me leaving and returning, with no interruption. I felt a tightening in my chest that I attributed to stress. I reset the items and completed the photography, forcing myself to remain calm. The rearrangement itself was not threatening. It was precise, intentional. By 5:30 p.m., the vault felt smaller. I was aware of every sound. When I finished the final container, I secured the evidence and prepared to leave. Before doing so, I conducted one last walk through as required. That was when I noticed that the items from the 6 cases recovered that week had been grouped together on a single table. I had not done this. The grouping was not random. Items were paired in a way that suggested correspondence. A left boot beside a right glove, a watch beside a phone, a notebook beside a map. The dinosaur figurine stood between them, facing the exit. I did not touch anything. I documented the arrangement with photographs and exited the vault. I reported the incident to the duty supervisor, who reviewed the footage and logs with me. There was no evidence of interference. I was advised to file a maintenance request for the HVA sensors and to take the evening off. I complied. At 7:00 p.m., I left the building with the unease still tightly contained. At home, I tried to sleep but could not. I kept thinking about the precision of the placements, the way unrelated items had been brought into relation with one another. At 11:48 p.m., my phone vibrated with an automated alert from the facility's monitoring system. A motion sensor in the evidence vault had been triggered. The alert was brief and resolved within seconds. No breach was recorded. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing that whatever had rearranged those items had done so without entering, without leaving a trace, and without haste. I returned to work the next morning, determined to treat the incident as an anomaly. But as I unlocked the vault, I saw that the table was already set. The items were arranged in a straight line, leading from the intake door to my workstation. At the end of the line, placed carefully on my chair, was the dinosaur figurine. It was facing me. I remained standing in the doorway longer than procedure allowed. The chair was mine. I recognized the slight tear in the vinyl on the right armrest, the height adjustment I never bothered to change. I did not touch the figurine immediately. I documented its placement first, photographing the chair from multiple angles. my hands steady only because training had replaced instinct. The figurine was clean. No dust, no fibers. It had been placed there deliberately, balanced so it faced the doorway at eye level. I removed it using gloves and placed it back into its assigned tray. I told myself, very carefully, that there were only 3 possible explanations: an internal security failure, an elaborate but misguided prank, or my own error compounded by exhaustion. I did not allow myself to consider anything else. I checked the access logs again. No entries overnight. I reviewed the motion alert in detail. It had triggered for exactly 7 seconds. Not enough time for a person to enter, rearrange, and exit. Too long to be a false spike. The cameras showed no visible movement. The items were already arranged when the feed resumed. I began my shift with a new rule: nothing left unattended, even for seconds. I brought gloves, labels, and cleaning wipes to my workstation. I worked slowly, narrating actions aloud under my breath, grounding myself in sequence. At 8:40 a.m., I logged a set of keys recovered from a ravine. At 9:15 a.m., I logged a torn backpack strap. At 10:00 a.m., I noticed that the wristwatch from the previous day was ticking again. I had confirmed it was non-functional. The battery had been corroded. Now the second hand moved in a steady rhythm. I removed the case back. The battery was still dead. At 10:37 a.m., I realized the rearrangements were no longer subtle. Items were not simply moved, they were being ordered. I found personal effects grouped by proximity of recovery rather than by case number. A glove from one case lay beside a jacket from another. Both recovered near the same river bend. A notebook from a third case was paired with a map from a fourth, both marked with the same trailhead. The dinosaur figurine appeared repeatedly, positioned like a marker, always facing the next grouping. I checked the case files. The 6 missing persons had not been linked officially. Different ages, different backgrounds, different reasons for being in the wilderness. But the items suggested otherwise. I followed the implied sequence, laying the groupings out on a larger table. The arrangement formed a rough path. When I overlaid a regional map, my stomach tightened. The path traced a single day's hike, beginning at a popular trailhead and ending a remote drainage area where no bodies had been recovered. At 12:00 p.m., the lights flickered. The HVAC's hum deepened briefly, then returned to normal. I stood very still. The dinosaur figurine had moved again. It now stood at the end of the map path, directly atop the drainage area. Its head was angled downward, as if looking at something below the surface. I called my supervisor. I explained what I was seeing, sticking to facts. He listened, then told me to take a break and step outside. I refused. I said I would remain in the vault but would stop handling items. He agreed reluctantly and said he would come down himself. He never did. At 12:46 p.m., he called to say he had been pulled into an emergency meeting and would review everything later. The rearrangements continued even as I watched. Not in motion. Never in motion. I would look away to check a note, look back, and find a change. A keychain rotated. A glove folded more neatly. The watch now pointed its face toward me no matter where I stood. I tested this by moving around the table. Each time I looked back, the watch had turned. At 2:03 p.m., I heard a sound that did not belong. It was not loud. It was the sound of objects touching gently, like fabric brushing plastic. I froze. The sound came again, closer. I realized it was coming from behind me. When I turned, the dinosaur figurine stood on the floor, directly behind my chair. I had not moved it. It was closer than before, positioned as if it had followed me. I backed away slowly, maintaining eye contact with the figurine, despite knowing how irrational that was. I told myself it was a prank. Someone had found a way past the sensors. Someone was watching. That explanation was thin, but it was still human. I reached the exit and sealed the vault. As the door closed, I heard the sound again, louder now, as if multiple items were being handled at once. I did not leave the building. I went to the control room and reviewed the live feed. The vault appeared unchanged. Items lay where I had last seen them. The figurine was back on the table. I felt a wave of nausea. I rewound the footage. There was no moment where it left the table. No gap, no glitch. At 4:15 p.m., a new container arrived unexpectedly. No paperwork accompanied it. The label read only, "Recovered, unassigned." I should not have accepted it. I did anyway. Inside was a single item. A laminated evidence tag with no writing, its string frayed as if cut. It was identical to the tags I used every day. I logged it reluctantly, assigning it a temporary number. When I placed the tag on the table, the other items shifted. Not all at once. One by one, between blinks, they aligned around it. The watch stopped ticking. The phone screen lit up briefly, displaying no signal. The figurine stood at the head of the arrangement, facing the tag. I understood then that the items were not being rearranged randomly. They were being catalogued. Not by me. At 6:00 p.m., the arrangement changed for the final time that day. The path I had mapped earlier extended beyond the drainage area, beyond where any search had gone. The final placement was clear. The dinosaur figurine stood alone at the far edge of the table, facing a blank space. Facing where the next item should be. My access badge failed at 7:00 p.m. I was still inside. The system logged me as having exited. I watched the timestamp change, watched my own absence recorded officially. When the lights dimmed for night mode, I remained standing in the vault, surrounded by objects that knew where they belonged. I knew I was not supposed to be inside anymore. The system said I had left. My badge history showed a clean exit at exactly 7:00 p.m. Even though I was standing in the vault watching the lights dim. That mattered more than the locked doors. Doors can fail. Records are supposed to be final. Night mode reduced the overhead lighting to a dull, uniform glow. The temperature dropped by 2 degrees. The HVAC adjusted automatically, preserving objects that no longer felt inert. I stood still, listening to my own breathing, aware that if I made a sound it would be the only one in the room that had not been carefully placed. The arrangement on the central table was stable. Everything held its position with the quiet confidence of something complete, except for the empty space at the end of the path. The space was not vague. It was exact, rectangular, the size of a standard evidence tray. I did not want to fill it. The thought came unbidden and fully formed. Do not complete the sequence. That was the first time I acknowledged intention, not mine, pressing against the edges of the room. I moved toward the control panel mounted beside the exit. The door did not respond. No error tone, no resistance. The interface simply ignored me, as if the concept of my presence had already been resolved. I pressed the emergency call button. Nothing happened. I checked my phone. No signal. No time displayed. The screen was lit but empty. Behind me, something touched something else. I did not turn immediately. I counted my breaths. When I did turn, the blank evidence tag tray I had logged earlier was no longer where I left it. It now occupied the empty space at the end of the path. The laminated tag lay inside it, perfectly centered. The string was no longer frayed. It had been knotted neatly, the way field agents tie tags when they expect them to be handled later. I approached the table slowly. Each step felt like a concession. The watch was no longer facing me. It was facing the tag. The phone screen was dark. The glove lay open, palm up. The dinosaur figurine stood beside the tray, angled toward it, as if presenting it. I realized then that nothing else was going to move. The rearrangements had stopped because they were finished. I should have waited. I should have done nothing. Instead, I reached for the tray. The moment my gloved fingers touched the edge, the lights brightened slightly, as if acknowledging a successful input. The HVAC's hum shifted pitch. The vault felt attentive. The tag was blank but warm. That should not have been possible. I turned it over. On the back, where case numbers are sometimes penciled lightly before formal logging, there was a single line of writing. It was not printed. It was not etched. It looked as though it had always been there, and I had simply failed to notice it. Price S. I let go of the tray. It remained exactly where it was. My name was written in the same block lettering I use every day. Same spacing. Same pressure marks. I understood with a clarity that was almost relieving that the system had not malfunctioned. It had updated. The items on the table did not belong to the missing people anymore. They were no longer remnants. They were references. Each object marked a point along a route that had been walked once, in sequence, without deviation. The path did not end in the wilderness. It ended here. The sound returned, closer now, but still gentle. Fabric against plastic, metal against laminate. The sound of careful handling. I felt it behind me without seeing it, the way you feel someone standing too close in a quiet room. I did not turn. I did not need to. I spoke because silence felt like consent. I said my name aloud, formally, the way I introduce myself at the beginning of reports. I stated my role. I stated the date. I said I was present and accounted for. The words sounded thin in the air. When I finished, the sound stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the dinosaur figurine tipped forward, just enough to touch the edge of the tray. It was not a gesture. It was a confirmation. The lights returned to full brightness. The vault door unlocked with a soft click. My phone buzzed. Time returned to the screen. 7:01 p.m. I was alone. I did not run. I logged the contents of the tray. I filled out the fields with shaking hands, noting condition, placement, and identifying marks. When I reached the subject field, I hesitated, then wrote my full name. The system accepted it without correction. I left the vault at 7:12 p.m. The access log recorded my entry at 7:11 and my exit at 7:12. There was no record of me being inside before that. The duty supervisor was gone. The building was quiet. Outside, the sky was darkening in the ordinary way, traffic moving, people unaware. At home, I did not sleep. I waited for something to follow. Nothing did. No rearrangements, no sounds, no alerts. At 11:59 p.m., my phone received a final automated message from the facility system, one I had never seen before. KSTUSUPATET. I reported the events the next morning. The vault showed no anomalies. The tray was gone. The tag did not exist in the database. The 6 cases remained unresolved. My access history showed a normal shift with no irregularities. I was advised to take leave. I no longer work there. I cannot be around objects that have been left behind. I know now that missing does not mean absent. It means unfiled. Some systems do not tolerate gaps. They will arrange what they have until the pattern closes. I have stopped carrying personal items whenever possible. No watch. No keys. No photographs. I leave nothing that could be placed. Because I understand what happens when there is an empty space. My name is Owen Fletcher. At the time of the incident, I was a certified search and rescue technician attached to a regional SAR unit that primarily handled wilderness disappearances across state, managed forest land. I had been with the team for 7 years, long enough to develop a reliable sense for what a normal missing person call looked like and, more importantly, what it did not. The case I am about to describe occurred during a single operational day in early autumn, one that began as a routine response and ended with conclusions none of us were prepared to formally document. The call came in just after dawn. A family of 4 had failed to return from a 2-night stay at a designated campground tucked deep within a mixed pine and hardwood forest. The site was accessible by a maintained gravel road, had marked fire rings, and was frequently used by families due to its proximity to a shallow river bend. When the campground host arrived that morning to perform routine checks, the family's vehicle was still parked neatly in its assigned space. There were no signs of activity since the previous afternoon. By protocol, that alone justified a welfare check. By the time we were dispatched, the concern had escalated into a full SAR activation. I arrived at the staging area just before 0900 hours. The air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that carries sound too clearly. The incident commander briefed us with minimal speculation. 2 adults, 2 children. No known medical conditions. No history of domestic issues. Cell phones last pinned within the campground boundary at approximately 16:30 the previous day. No outgoing distress calls. No weather events overnight. The family had informed relatives they would be home by noon. They were now overdue by more than 18 hours. We moved in on foot in small teams. I was assigned a perimeter sweep, approaching the campground from the riverside to check for water-related hazards. As we entered the clearing, the first thing that struck me was how intact everything looked. The family's tent was fully erected, stakes properly driven, rainfly secured. A picnic table held 4 plates with remnants of a cold breakfast. The fire ring contained ash, but no signs of a hasty extinguish. Chairs were folded and stacked. Shoes were lined up near the tent entrance. It looked less like a campsite that had been abandoned, and more like one paused mid-routine. We documented everything before touching a single object. No footprints leading away from the site that couldn't be attributed to the family's earlier movements. No drag marks. No broken brush. The ground was dry enough that tracks should have been visible. I checked along the riverbank, expecting at least disturbance in the mud or reeds. There was nothing. The water was shallow, slow-moving, and clear. No scuffed stones, no displaced vegetation. As the morning wore on, the unease grew. Each search team reported the same thing. Nothing out of place. No signs of panic, struggle, or even indecision. The family hadn't packed up. They hadn't wandered. They hadn't left behind anything that suggested urgency. It was as if they had all stood up at the same moment and stepped out of the environment entirely. Around midday, I was reassigned to assist with a grid search, extending into the tree line behind the campground. We moved methodically, spacing ourselves according to protocol, calling out names at regular intervals. Our voices felt intrusive in that quiet, like we were violating a space that had already decided it didn't want witnesses. every few minutes. My radio crackled with routine status updates, all of them negative. About an hour into the grid, I noticed something that initially seemed insignificant. The forest floor showed faint impressions, shallow enough that I might have dismissed them under different circumstances. They were footprints, but not directional in any meaningful sense. They overlapped, circled, and returned on themselves. I followed them for several meters before realizing they formed no path outward. They stayed confined to a rough oval area, no more than 20 feet across, before simply stopping. I marked the location and called it in. When the incident commander arrived, we both stood there in silence longer than necessary. The prints were inconsistent in size, suggesting multiple individuals, but there were no corresponding entry or exit tracks. It was as if the ground had briefly remembered movement and then forgotten how it ended. By mid-afternoon, we expanded the search radius. Canine units were brought in, but their behavior was unusual. The dogs showed interest at the campsite itself, then lost the scent almost immediately upon entering the forest. One handler commented that it was like the trail had been lifted cleanly off the ground. Not dispersed, not masked, removed. At 1600 hours, we were instructed to regroup near the campground for a final daylight sweep. I returned to the clearing, fatigue settling in alongside a growing sense of disorientation. The campsite looked unchanged, but I felt a pressure in my chest that I couldn't explain. As I walked past the tent, I noticed something new. Inside, visible through the open flap, were the family's phones laid out in a straight line, screens dark, powered off. None of us had seen them there during the initial documentation. We froze. No one admitted to moving them. No one could explain how we'd missed them earlier. We reviewed body cam footage later. In the morning, the phones were not there. The incident commander ordered an immediate halt to the search pending further evaluation. It was nearly sunset. We were instructed to maintain position and observe. I stood at the edge of the clearing as the light thinned and the forest shifted into shadow. That was when I noticed the silence wasn't natural. There were no insects, no birds settling in for the night. Even the river seemed muted, its sound flattened, distant. At approximately 17:05 hours, every radio on site emitted a brief burst of static, just long enough for all of us to notice. Then, in my earpiece, I heard a voice say my name. It was calm, clear, and close, as if someone were standing just behind me. I turned, heart racing, expecting to see one of my teammates. There was no one there. When I asked over the radio who had called me, there was only silence in response. We remained on site as night approached, bound by protocol and by something less definable that none of us were willing to articulate. The family was still missing. The campground remained undisturbed, and whatever explanation we were going to find had not yet revealed itself. Night settled over the campground without ceremony. There was no gradual easing of sound or light, just a sudden sense that the forest had closed a door behind us. We set up portable lighting along the perimeter of the clearing, careful not to disturb anything within the campsite itself. The incident commander decided we would hold position through the night, rotating watch in pairs. It was framed as a precaution, but the truth was simpler. None of us wanted to be the first to leave. I was paired with a technician, named Marcus, for the first watch. We positioned ourselves near the tree line, where the faint footprints had been found earlier, radios clipped high, headlamps angled low. The light felt inadequate, as if it were being absorbed rather than reflected. We spoke quietly, mostly to confirm that we were still there, still solid. Every few minutes, I caught myself listening for something I couldn't define, a sound that never arrived. Around 1900 hours, the incident commander requested a status check. Each unit responded in turn. When it came time for Marcus and me, my radio hesitated before transmitting. A half-second delay that made my voice sound unfamiliar in my own ears. The commander acknowledged, but his reply came back distorted, stretched thin. We exchanged a look that said neither of us liked what we were hearing. As the hours passed, the silence deepened. It wasn't just the absence of wildlife, it was the lack of environmental noise altogether. Wind moved the treetops, but there was no rustle. Branches swayed without creaking. Even our footsteps seemed muted, as though the ground were padded. I checked my watch repeatedly, expecting time to drag, but it moved too quickly, minutes slipping by without the usual wait. At approximately 20:30, one of the canine handlers radioed in. His voice was tight, controlled, but strained. He reported that his dog had begun pulling toward the campground, refusing commands to redirect. When he attempted to restrain it, the animal froze, ears flat, tail tucked, and would not move at all. They withdrew shortly after, citing safety concerns. No one argued. Shortly after that transmission, my radio crackled again. This time, there was no static burst beforehand. Just a voice, low and deliberate, speaking into the open channel. It was not distorted. It did not sound like interference. "Dad." The word landed heavily in the quiet. No call sign, no identifier. Just that single syllable, spoken with the flat certainty of someone expecting an answer. Every unit went silent at once. I felt my pulse in my throat as the incident commander demanded clarification, his tone sharp enough to cut through the moment. There was no response. The channel remained open, a soft hiss of dead air filling the space where a voice had been. We regrouped in the clearing. Head counts were taken, then taken again. Every member accounted for. No children on site, no civilians anywhere near the operation area. We stood in a loose circle under the portable lights, faces pale, eyes searching one another for reassurance that none of us were thinking what we were thinking. The decision was made to perform a controlled sweep of the immediate area around the campsite, no more than 50 meters out. Just enough to confirm that no one had wandered in unnoticed. I volunteered to take the lead on the eastern edge, partly out of duty and partly because standing still felt worse. As I moved into the trees, my headlamp caught on something that hadn't been there before. A small object hung from a low branch, swaying gently despite the lack of wind. When I approached, I recognized it immediately. It was a child's jacket, bright blue, the kind designed to stand out against foliage. It was clean, too clean. No dirt, no tears, no sign it had been dragged through underbrush. I radioed it in, my voice steady through practice rather than calm. When the incident commander joined me, we examined the jacket without touching it. It matched one described in the missing family report. The problem was location. The branch it hung from was nearly 7 feet off the ground. There were no broken twigs, no scuffed bark, no indication of how it had gotten there. We marked the find and pulled back. No one suggested continuing deeper into the forest. The sense that we were being observed had become impossible to ignore. Not watched, exactly, but noted like entries being made somewhere out of sight. Around 200 hours, the temperature dropped sharply. Breath fogged the air. but the ground showed no frost. I noticed then that my hands were shaking, not from cold but from a sustained, low-grade adrenaline that had nowhere to go. Marcus handed me a bottle of water, and I realized I hadn't taken a drink in hours. The water tasted flat, stale, as if it had been sitting open for days. The next radio incident happened without warning. Multiple channels activated at once, overlapping voices bleeding through. I heard the incident commander issuing instructions, a handler calling for confirmation, and beneath it all, a soft, rhythmic sound that didn't belong to any of us. It took me a moment to recognize it as breathing. Slow, measured, amplified by the open microphones. Then it stopped. Every channel went dead simultaneously. Not static, not interference. Silence. We switched to backup radios. They powered on without issue. But the range was diminished, signals dropping after a few meters. The incident commander made the call to consolidate at the campsite and hold until first light. No one objected. The idea of moving blindly through that forest felt reckless. I took the second watch, standing alone near the picnic table. The plates were still there, food untouched, now rimed with moisture from the cooling air. I stared at them longer than necessary, imagining the family sitting there, unaware that their last ordinary moment had already passed. The thought felt intrusive, almost disrespectful, and I forced myself to look away. It was then that I heard footsteps. They were light, unhurried, circling the clearing just beyond the reach of our lights. I radioed in immediately, describing the sound, its direction, its pace. Others reported hearing it too, always just outside visual range. We called out, identifying ourselves, instructing anyone present to respond. The footsteps never changed speed. They never approached. They never retreated. At 23:17 hours, the footsteps stopped. In their place came voices. Multiple, overlapping, indistinct. They sounded like conversation heard through a wall, muffled and fragmented. I caught pieces that made my stomach turn. A woman asking where the kids were. A man saying they'd be right back. A child laughing, then abruptly silenced. No one slept that night. We stood together in the clearing, lights trained outward, waiting for dawn with a desperation that bordered on prayer. Whatever had taken that family had not left the area. It had simply settled in, content to let us know it was there. By the time the eastern sky began to pale, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. We weren't searching anymore. We were being kept. Dawn arrived thin and colorless, a pale wash that failed to warm anything it touched. The forest did not resume its normal rhythm. There were still no birds, no insects. Even the river sounded distant, as if the water were flowing somewhere else, and we were only hearing an echo of it. When the light finally became strong enough to see beyond the immediate reach of our lamps, the clearing looked exactly as it had the previous morning. Too exact. Nothing had shifted overnight. No condensation disturbed the soil. No debris had fallen. It felt preserved like a display set behind glass. The incident commander ordered a final coordinated sweep before standing the operation down. His voice carried the fatigue we all felt, but also a resolve that bordered on urgency. Daylight meant witnesses again. It meant the forest would soon have to explain itself, or at least pretend to. We broke into teams and moved out carefully, documenting every step, every sound, every absence of sound. I was assigned to follow the perimeter path along the western edge, the one that led toward the gravel access road. The idea was simple. If the family had left on foot, intentionally or otherwise, they would have crossed that boundary. The logic felt thin, but it was all we had left. As I walked, I noticed something subtle but persistent. The forest floor felt uneven in a way it hadn't before, not physically but visually. Depth was hard to judge. Roots seemed closer or farther away than they should have been. I slowed my pace, forcing myself to move deliberately, to trust each step. About 30 meters from the clearing, I saw the first undeniable sign of change. The ground ahead was marked with footprints, clear this time, defined, 4 sets moving together. 2 adult, 2 child. They were oriented toward the campground, not away from it. The spacing suggested a family walking side by side, unhurried. I radioed it in, my voice steady out of habit, and waited for confirmation to proceed. The incident commander arrived quickly. We stood over the prints in silence. They were fresh. Too fresh. The edges were crisp, the impressions deep enough to suggest weight, but the soil around them was undisturbed. No scuffing. No drag. Just clean. Deliberate placement. As if the ground had been pressed upward to meet them, rather than the other way around. We followed the tracks back toward the clearing. They led straight to the campsite and stopped at the edge of the picnic area. No overlapping. No hesitation. They ended neatly, toes aligned with the fire ring. As if the family had arrived and simply ceased to require contact with the ground. Someone swore quietly behind me. Another member crossed themselves. The incident commander ordered us to mark the location and pull back. His face had gone pale. The lines around his mouth set hard. He didn't say it aloud, but the implication was clear. These weren't escape tracks. They were return tracks. At 0830 hours, a call came in from dispatch. The family's vehicle had just been reported arriving in their home driveway. Neighbors had called it in, confused by its sudden appearance. No one had seen it arrive. There was no footage on nearby cameras showing it on the road. It was simply there, parked cleanly, keys in the ignition, fuel tank half full. Inside the vehicle were the family's wallets, ID, and a cooler that had not been with them at the campground. The clearing erupted in overlapping radio traffic. Questions. Requests for clarification. Demands for confirmation. I felt a hollow sensation open in my chest, the kind that comes when reality tilts and doesn't immediately right itself. The incident commander silenced the chatter and acknowledged the report. His response was clipped, professional, and utterly inadequate to what we were processing. Shortly after, we found the last item. It was near the fire ring, placed carefully on the flat stone at its center. A folded sheet of notebook paper, edges crisp, unmarked by moisture or ash. None of us recalled seeing it there before. We photographed it in place before anyone touched it. When the commander finally unfolded it, the writing inside was neat, deliberate, and unsettlingly calm. It read simply, "We stayed until morning." There was no signature, no date, no indication of who had written it or when. The handwriting did not match any sample later recovered from the family's home. That was when the forest changed. Sound returned first. A bird call, distant but unmistakable. Then another. Wind moved through the trees with a familiar rustle. The river's murmur grew closer, fuller. The oppressive weight that had pressed in on us since the previous evening lifted all at once, leaving behind a sense of vertigo, like stepping off a boat after rough water. By 1,000 hours, the operation was officially suspended. Not concluded. Suspended. The family was reclassified as missing under circumstances that defied categorization. We packed up our equipment in silence. avoiding the campsite as much as possible. No one wanted to be the last to leave the clearing. I was among the final team assigned to walk the perimeter one last time. As I moved toward the access road, I glanced back without meaning to. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement near the tent. 4 figures standing together, just at the edge of visibility, watching us go. When I blinked, they were gone. The campsite was empty. Later that afternoon, we were debriefed and released. Statements were taken. Reports were written and rewritten, each version more cautious than the last. Certain details were omitted. Others were softened until they lost their original shape. The note was logged as an unexplained artifact. The radio transmissions were attributed to interference. The footprints were classified as inconclusive due to environmental factors. The family has not been found. Their home remains empty. The vehicle sits in the driveway, exactly where it appeared that morning. No fingerprints beyond what should be there. No signs of reentry. Neighbors report lights turning on and off at night, but nothing that can be substantiated. As for me, I no longer take assignments near that region. Officially, it's a scheduling issue. Unofficially, I know better. Some places do not lose people. They keep them. And sometimes, when they are finished, they give back only what they choose. The entire incident took place within a single day. 24 hours from first dispatch to suspension. It was enough. I still hear the radio sometimes late at night when everything else is quiet. Just a breath of static. A pause. And then nothing at all. My name is Nathan Cole. I was assigned as a wildfire lookout during a late-season rotation intended to monitor residual smoke columns and ensure that all restricted zones remained clear after a series of fast-moving burns. I make this record now not as an act of drama, but because official reports reduce what happened to numbers, timestamps, and acreage. They do not account for voices. They do not explain absence. And they do not explain why people continued to vanish from terrain that had already been searched, cleared, and formally closed. On paper, my assignment was routine. The fire complex had been largely contained, leaving behind a lattice of blackened ridgelines, ash-coated switchbacks, and evacuation corridors marked with fresh signage. My tower overlooked a broad section of forest that had been declared unsafe for public access. All trailheads feeding into it were barricaded. Permits were revoked. Rangers posted patrols during daylight hours. By every measurable standard, no one should have been out there. I arrived before dawn. The air still carried a faint chemical sharpness from retardant drops, and the forest smelled scorched but quiet, like something that had already finished screaming. I logged my equipment check, calibrated the binoculars, tested the radio, and began the standard rotation notes. This is when I activated my personal audio recorder. It was not required, but I had developed the habit during long solo assignments. It helped structure my thoughts. It helped keep me anchored. By mid-morning, the first report came in. A hiker was missing. The call came through dispatch with the clipped neutrality of procedure. Adult male. Entered the region 3 days prior. Last known location was a trail segment that no longer officially existed, having been erased by fire and subsequently closed. His vehicle was found parked at a legal pool, off outside the restricted zone. Foot patrols had already swept the accessible areas. No signs of forced entry. No distress calls logged. I remember looking out across the burned valley and feeling a brief, unwarranted irritation. People ignored closures all the time. That was the working assumption. Someone had crossed a barricade, wandered into unstable terrain, and gotten themselves into trouble. It was tragic, but not unusual. What unsettled me was the map. The coordinates attached to the report corresponded to an area I had personally logged as visually clear less than an hour earlier. I had scanned that slope through high-powered optics. I had noted no movement, no smoke, no reflective gear. Nothing. I recorded that discrepancy aloud, intending to flag it later. At the time, it felt like diligence. In hindsight, it was the first of many corrections I would never be allowed to submit. As the day progressed, more details filtered in. Search teams confirmed the hiker had been traveling alone. No overnight pack. No indication he intended to cross into the burned scar. His phone last pinged from within the closed zone, then went silent. That final ping placed him on a stretch of ground that had been cleared twice already, once during containment operations, and again the previous afternoon during a precautionary sweep. At 11:42 a.m., I noted movement. It was minor. A flicker of color against gray ash, far below the tower. I adjusted the scope and saw what looked like a backpack strap catching light. I called it in immediately, giving precise bearings. Dispatch acknowledged and redirected a nearby patrol. When I checked again less than 2 minutes later, the movement was gone. The patrol reached the location within half an hour. They found nothing. No pack, no footprints. The ground was soft with ash, which should have preserved impressions clearly. There were none. I recorded my confusion carefully, choosing words that could not be misinterpreted as speculation. Visual anomaly. Possible equipment reflection. Line of sight interference. The language of plausibility. At 1:07 p.m., the second disappearance was reported. This time it was a couple. Experienced hikers. According to their permits, they had checked in at a ranger station 2 days earlier and altered their route to avoid the fire zone. Or so they claimed. Their planned trail never intersected the closure. And yet, their last recorded position placed them squarely within it. By then, something in me had shifted. Not fear, exactly. A tightening. A sense that the facts were stacking in the wrong order. I replayed my earlier audio logs, listening for hesitation in my voice. There was none. Only the slow, methodical cadence of someone trying to stay professional while his reference points dissolved. I scanned again. The forest looked emptied out. No birds, no insects. The burned scar absorbed sound. Even the wind seemed reluctant to cross it. At 20:15 p.m., I heard something through the open tower window. It was faint. Human, but distorted by distance. A voice carrying uphill in uneven bursts, as if the speaker kept stopping or being interrupted. I could not make out words, only cadence. I froze, recorder still running, and leaned out farther. The voice came again, closer this time. I radioed dispatch, reporting possible vocal contact within the restricted zone. There was a pause on the line. Then I was told no search teams were currently operating in that sector. All personnel had been pulled back due to unstable ground temperatures. I remember asking, very clearly, who was calling out there then. No one answered me directly. I grabbed the binoculars and tracked the sound. It seemed to originate from a drainage corridor that had been burned clean. A narrow scar of exposed earth between two slopes. I swept the area repeatedly. Nothing moved. The voice rose again, strained now, carrying what sounded like urgency. I could have sworn it was calling my name. I dismissed that immediately. Names carry strangely in open terrain. The mind fills gaps. I recorded myself stating that fact aloud, as if documenting it would make it true. At 3:30 p.m., the third report came in. Another solo hiker. Entered after the closure went into effect. His trailhead sign in was time-stamped incorrectly. Logged under a ranger ID that had not been active for over a year. Dispatch blamed a system error. I stopped believing them. By late afternoon, the missing count stood at 4. All within zones declared cleared. All without physical trace. All tied by data or sound or sight to ground I had already verified. The voice returned once more, just before dusk. This time it was unmistakably plural. Overlapping speech. Fragmented. Like people trying to talk over one another through smoke. I stood at the window, recorder clutched in my hand, and felt a certainty settle over me that I did not want and could not rationalize. Whatever was happening down there was not moving people into the forest. It was keeping them there. The sun dipped behind the ridge, throwing the burned scar into shadow. My shift log ended on paper at 6:00 p.m., but I did not stop recording. Because the voices did not stop when the light went. The light failed faster than I expected. One moment the slopes still held color. The next they were flattened into layers of black and gray, contours erased by shadow. I noted the time aloud out of habit, though my watch already told me what I needed to know. Sunset had come early because the smoke, still hanging in the upper atmosphere, bent the light, shortened the day. It made everything feel rushed, as if the forest itself was trying to finish something before night fully settled in. I stayed at the window longer than procedure recommended. Officially, once visibility dropped below a certain threshold, long-range spotting lost priority to equipment monitoring and overnight hazard checks. Unofficially, no one was going to force me away from the only vantage point that made sense anymore. The voices returned just after civil twilight ended. They did not rise from one direction this time. They came from several points at once. Faint but distinct enough that I could no longer tell myself it was wind or echo. They overlapped in irregular intervals, never synchronizing, never forming anything I could cleanly separate into individual speakers. It sounded like fragments of conversations, carried uphill and broken apart, as if the forest were passing them hand to hand, and losing pieces along the way. I raised the recorder and spoke slowly, clearly, stating exactly what I was hearing and when. My training insisted on neutrality. Describe, don't interpret. But my throat kept tightening, and I had to pause more than once to steady my voice. I radioed dispatch again. This time, there was a longer delay before they responded. When someone finally came on the line, the voice was not one I recognized from earlier in the day. I reported the continued vocal activity and asked again if any personnel were operating inside the closure. The answer was still no. Then, after a brief hesitation that felt deliberate, the dispatcher asked me to confirm that no civilians were present in my immediate vicinity. The question didn't make sense. I told them I was alone in the tower, as scheduled. There was another pause. Then I was instructed to remain inside, secure all access points, and continue logging conditions until relief arrived in the morning. Relief was not scheduled until noon the next day. I acknowledged the instruction and ended the transmission. The radio crackled once after I set it down, as if someone had keyed in too late, but no voice followed. I locked the hatch. I did not turn away from the window. The burned scar below had gone completely dark. Without sunlight, the ash absorbed what little ambient glow remained. creating the impression of depthless ground, like a hole cut into the forest. My binoculars were useless now. I switched to the thermal scope, telling myself I was checking for residual hotspots, not bodies. The screen bloomed with false color. Rocks still held heat from the day. Fallen trunks traced dull red lines where they lay half buried. The terrain resolved into familiar patterns. Then I saw movement. It was not fast. That was what made it unmistakable. Heat signatures shifted in slow, deliberate paths along the drainage corridor. Human-sized. Several of them. They did not cluster the way search teams did. They did not spread the way animals scattered. They moved as if following something already laid out for them. A trail. I called it in immediately, switching channels to emergency priority. I gave bearings, elevation, thermal confirmation. My voice shook despite my effort to control it. This was no longer ambiguous. This was proof. Dispatch answered quickly this time, but what they said made no sense. They told me to stand by. Not to track. Not to continue observation. Just to stand by. I asked why. The reply came softer, almost careful. They said the signatures I was seeing did not correspond to any registered missing persons. I stared at the scope, at the slow procession of heat, moving through ground that should have been empty, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. I asked how that was possible. No one answered. The transmission ended on their side without warning. The voices below grew louder. They were no longer indistinct. Individual tones began to separate. I could hear strain, panic, confusion. I could hear someone crying. I could hear someone shouting directions that did not sound like trail names or landmarks, but numbers. Sequences. As if they were trying to read something in the dark. I backed away from the window and forced myself to sit at the desk. I needed to ground myself, to anchor my thoughts in process. I began an equipment check that did not need to be done, narrating each step into the recorder. Battery levels, wind gauge, smoke sensor calibration, familiarity as defense. That was when the knock came. It was not loud, just a firm, deliberate sound against the tower's outer wall, below the level of the window. Too controlled to be debris, too measured to be wind. I froze. No one could reach the tower on foot that quickly, not from the valley floor. The access trail had been damaged during the fire and was partially collapsed. Even before the burn, it took hours to climb. The knock came again. I did not answer. I did not move. I listened to my own breathing on the recorder and hated how loud it sounded. A voice followed. Close. Right beneath the floorboards. It said my name, not shouted, not pleaded. Spoken the way someone speaks when they are certain you are already listening. I backed away until I hit the wall opposite the hatch. Every instinct screamed at me to respond, to demand identification, to reassert authority. Training drilled into me that silence could escalate situations, but nothing about this fit training. I checked the time. It was still the same day, still the same shift. Nothing had crossed midnight yet. I clung to that fact as if it mattered. The voice continued. It began listing things. Details about the tower, about my equipment, about earlier logs I had spoken aloud. It repeated my own words back to me, slightly out of order, as if it were learning them secondhand. I realized then that the audio recorder was still running. I turned it off. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. The voices stopped. The knock did not repeat. Even the forest noise, sparse as it had been, vanished. I stood there in the dark, heart hammering, wondering if I had just made a mistake I could not undo. After a long minute, I turned the recorder back on. The voices returned at once, louder than before, now carrying anger. Not rage. Something colder. As if I had violated an expectation. The thermal scope alarm sounded suddenly, shrill and sharp. I rushed back to the desk and looked. The heat signatures were gone. Every single one. The ground below read cold. Uniform. Empty. I sank into the chair, hands shaking, and spoke into the recorder with a clarity born of exhaustion. Something was wrong with the cleared zones. Whatever was happening did not respect closures or patrols or logic. People were not getting lost. They were being answered. The anger did not announce itself loudly. It manifested as pressure, the sense of being watched intensifying, until it felt almost physical, like weight settling on my shoulders. I checked the time again. Still the same date. The same shift. The day refused to end, as if night were being stretched thin around the tower. I resumed recording. I needed a record, even if no one ever reviewed it. Especially if no one ever reviewed it. I attempted to re-establish contact with dispatch. The radio powered on, the channel indicator lit, but the speaker produced only a low hiss. No carrier tone. No response to hails. I cycled through frequencies, emergency and secondary alike. Nothing. The silence felt deliberate, not like interference but like refusal. Below me, the forest remained unnaturally still. The voices did not return immediately. Instead, there was movement at the edge of my vision. Subtle shifts where darkness thickened and thinned along the perimeter of the burned scar. Not motion, exactly. Reorganization, as if the landscape were adjusting itself. I told myself fatigue could explain that. Smoke exposure, stress. The mind tries to impose patterns when deprived of rest. I recited those explanations aloud, hoping to convince myself through repetition. Then the thermal scope activated on its own. The screen lit without my touch, the familiar alarm tone replaced by a steady, pulsing indicator. Heat bloomed across the display. Not scattered signatures this time, but a continuous outline, tracing the boundaries of the cleared zone itself. The entire perimeter glowed faintly, like an ember ringed beneath ash. Inside it, nothing registered. The cleared area was not empty. It was contained. I leaned closer, heart pounding, and adjusted the sensitivity. The ring sharpened. I realized with growing dread that what I was seeing corresponded exactly to the posted closure boundaries, not the natural terrain. The forest outside the zone rayed normally. Cool, irregular, alive. Inside, the ground temperature was uniform, flattened, as if something had pressed down on it for hours. A voice spoke behind me. It did not knock this time. It did not announce itself. It simply began talking, close enough that I could feel breath against my ear. It used my voice. Not perfectly. The cadence was wrong. Pauses misplaced. But the tone, the pitch, it was unmistakably mine, repeating a phrase from earlier in the day. One I had spoken into the recorder while checking equipment. Hearing it from behind me made my stomach lurch. I did not turn around. The voice continued, cycling through fragments of my logs, stitching them together into sentences I had never spoken. It talked about visibility, about containment, about how the area was clear. It said that people trusted that. I forced myself to speak, to reclaim the sound in the room. I stated my name, my role, and ordered whoever was present to identify themselves. The words sounded small, brittle even to me. The voice laughed. Not a human laugh. A replication of one assembled from pieces of sound it had already heard. Short bursts. Incorrect rhythm. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It told me the zone was working as intended. I asked what that meant. The answer came slowly, as if translated. It said the fire had removed paths, landmarks, reference points. It said the closure had simplified the forest, reduced it, made it easier to listen. I backed toward the hatch, never taking my eyes off the reflection in the darkened window. I could not see anything behind me. No shape, no outline, just my own pale face, eyes too wide, framed by black. The voice said people entered looking for boundaries, for signs, for certainty. And when they found none, they called out. Something always answered. I reached the hatch and found it already unlocked. I knew I had locked it earlier. I remembered the sound. The weight of the metal latch sliding into place. The voice told me it hadn't unlocked it. It told me I had. The tower shuddered suddenly, a low vibration running through the supports. Not wind, not seismic. It felt like pressure being released, like a held breath exhaled all at once. The thermal scope alarm spiked again. I glanced back and saw the ring around the cleared zone flicker, then break in several places. The perimeter dimmed. The containment was failing. Below, heat signatures reappeared. Dozens this time. They surged toward the breaks in the boundary, moving faster than before, no longer slow or deliberate. Chaotic. Colliding. I could hear them now without the window open. Voices layered atop one another, rising in volume and panic. The voice behind me sounded pleased. It said the day was ending. I didn't wait to hear more. I slammed the hatch shut and threw my weight against it, sliding the lock home with shaking hands. The tower shook again, harder this time, as if something had struck it from below. I grabbed the radio and screamed into it, abandoning protocol entirely. I shouted my coordinates, my situation, my demand for immediate evacuation. The speaker crackled. Then a response came through. It was my own voice, delayed by several seconds, repeating my words back to me. I dropped the radio. The recorder lay on the desk, still running. I picked it up and spoke into it with a clarity that surprised me, forcing every word past the fear. If anyone finds this, do not trust cleared zones after a wildfire. Do not assume absence means safety. Fire removes more than vegetation. It removes memory. It resets places. Outside, the tower stairs groaned. Slow, heavy steps began to climb. I checked the time one last time. 11:58 p.m. still the same day. The steps stopped just below the hatch. The voice returned, no longer copying me. No longer pretending. It said my name once. Then it said the forest had learned enough. At midnight, the recorder cut out. I was found the next morning, sitting alone in the tower, equipment intact, no signs of struggle. My official report lists heat distortion, stress-induced hallucinations, and radio malfunction. The audio logs were confiscated. 4 hikers remain missing. The cleared zone is still closed. My name is Eli Morrison. At the time of the incident, I was 34 years old and serving as a volunteer tracker for a regional search and rescue auxiliary that operated in cooperation with local park authorities. My work was not romantic, and it was not heroic. It consisted of long hours spent reading the ground, following disturbances so subtle, most people would walk past them without noticing anything at all. Broken grass that bent against the wind. Soil compacted at the wrong angle. Pebbles displaced downhill when they should have scattered sideways. I had been doing this for nearly a decade, and by that point I trusted tracks more than I trusted people. The call came in shortly after sunrise. A solo backpacker had failed to check out at a remote, trailhead by nightfall the previous evening. His vehicle was still parked where he'd left it. Doors locked, food cache intact, no sign of a struggle. That alone wasn't unusual. People misjudge distances, lose time, or decide to camp an extra night. But what pushed the report from routine to urgent was the weather forecast. A cold front was moving in fast, bringing freezing rain by nightfall. If the backpacker was injured or disoriented, he wouldn't last long. By mid-morning, I was standing at the trailhead with 2 deputies, a park ranger, and another volunteer assigned to grid search later in the day. I introduced myself formally, gave my name and credentials, and reviewed the basic facts. Male, mid-20s. Experienced hiker according to his permit history, carrying standard overnight gear. No known medical issues. No emergency beacon. He had planned a simple out and back rock along a well-maintained trail with a single spur leading to an overlook. In theory, he should have been easy to find. I volunteered to take point on tracking, and no one objected. The ground conditions were good. Damp soil from the previous week's rain held impressions cleanly. I moved ahead of the others, eyes down, mind quiet, letting the patterns speak for themselves. Within 50 yards of the trailhead, I found the first clear sign, a right boot print. Size 11 or 12, with a distinctive heel scuff consistent with a slightly overpronated gait. The tread matched a popular mid-range hiking boot. I marked it, photographed it, and continued. For the first hour, everything was normal. The prints followed the trail exactly as expected, spacing consistent, stride length even. Where the trail narrowed, the hiker favored the left side. Where it widened, he drifted toward the center. I could see where he'd stopped once to adjust his pack. The deeper impressions of both feet, close together, the faint scuff where the pack had been shifted on his shoulders. These were the kinds of details that told me I was reading the right story. About 2 miles in, the trail curved gently east. The ground here was a mix of dirt and fine gravel, with patches of pine, needles that blurred edges but didn't erase them. That was where I slowed down. Something about the rhythm of the prints felt off. Not wrong exactly, but strained. Like a sentence that used all the correct words in the wrong order. I crouched lower, brushing needles aside with the back of my glove. The left footprint was clear. The right footprint was clear. The spacing was correct. The depth was correct, but the orientation wasn't. The prints didn't turn with the trail. They continued straight ahead, maintaining the same angle they'd had before the curve, as if the hiker had walked forward while the world bent around him. There was no pivot mark, no skid, no adjustment step. One print ended, and the next began, perfectly aligned, ignoring the change in direction beneath them. I checked myself immediately. Tracking errors come from assumptions. I forced my breathing to slow and scanned for alternate explanations. Could he have stepped off the trail deliberately? Possibly. But when people leave a trail intentionally, their body language changes. There's a hesitation, a half step, a shift of weight. None of that was there. These prints moved forward with purpose, each step placed cleanly after the last. I stood up and looked ahead. Off the trail, the terrain dropped slightly into a stand of trees. No clearing, no visible point of interest. Just forest. I radioed back to the ranger, described what I was seeing, and requested that the others hold position until I could confirm the track. My voice was steady. It didn't need to be anything else. Oddities happen. My job was to verify, not react. I followed the prints off the trail. For the next several hundred yards, they remained consistent. Same stride, same depth, same orientation. What bothered me wasn't just that they ignored the trail's curve, but that they ignored the terrain entirely. Roots didn't alter the step. Small rocks didn't shift the foot placement. It was as if the person walking had absolute certainty about where the ground would support them, even when it shouldn't have. I knelt again and pressed my fingers into one of the impressions. The soil was compacted evenly, heel to toe. This wasn't a jump or a stumble. It was walking. At around noon, the weather began to change. The light dimmed, clouds thickening into a uniform gray. I checked my watch and logged the time. According to the schedule, this was where the hiker should have been turning around to head back. Instead, his prints continued deeper into the forest. Then, without warning, they changed. Not gradually, not subtly. One step was normal. The next was wrong. The footprint ahead of me was reversed. The heel impression pointed toward me, the toe away. But the spacing between it and the previous print suggested uninterrupted forward movement. There were no overlapping marks. No sign that the person had turned in place. The direction of travel remained the same, but the orientation of the foot had flipped, as if the boot had rotated without the leg following. I stared at it longer than I should have. I remember thinking, very clearly, that this was the moment where training stopped being useful. Tracks aren't supposed to do that. Bodies don't move that way. I documented it. Photographs, measurements, notes. My hands were steady, but my pulse had picked up. I told myself that the hiker might have been injured, confused, walking backward for some reason I couldn't yet understand. People do strange things under stress. But the prints didn't support that theory. From that point on, every footprint was reversed. Heel toward me, toe away, perfectly aligned, perfectly spaced, still moving forward. I radioed again, more insistently this time, and asked for confirmation that anyone else had crossed this area. The answer came back negative. I was alone with the tracks. The forest was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. No birds. No wind through the canopy. Even my own footsteps sounded muted, like the ground was absorbing them. I followed the reversed prints for another quarter mile before they stopped. There was no scuff, no fade, no transition into harder ground. One print ended, and then there was nothing. Just undisturbed soil, pine needles lying exactly as they should have been. I circled the area slowly, expanding my search radius, expecting to find a continuation I'd missed. I didn't. I stood there for a long time, staring at the last impression, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be possible. Eventually, I realized my hands were shaking. When I looked up to orient myself, I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. My own footprints, leading back the way I had come, were oriented incorrectly. I hadn't noticed when it happened. I hadn't felt anything change. But there they were. My boots pressed into the soil with the same impossible reversal, heel pointing toward the direction I was moving away from. I radioed immediately, but all I got was static. The light was fading faster now, and the temperature was dropping. I made the decision to stop advancing and retrace my steps carefully, one at a time, watching the ground with an intensity that bordered on obsession. That was when I realized the forest ahead of me was not the same forest I'd entered that morning. I forced myself to breathe slowly and deliberately, counting each inhale and exhale the way I'd been, trained to do during long searches in bad terrain. Panic wastes time, and time was already working against me. The forest had not announced its change with anything dramatic. No sound, no movement. Just a subtle wrongness that settled into my awareness like a pressure headache. The trees ahead were spaced too evenly. Not in a planted way, but in a way that suggested repetition rather than randomness. The undergrowth thinned where it shouldn't have, exposing patches of bare soil untouched by needles or fallen branches. I turned in a slow circle, comparing landmarks to what I remembered from my approach, and none of them lined up. I knelt and examined my own tracks more closely. The reversed orientation was unmistakable. Heel impressions clean and deep, toe marks faint. Exactly how my boots usually registered when walking forward. Except they were facing the wrong way. I pressed my boot down next to one of the prints. Deliberately, carefully, watching how the soil compressed. The fresh print matched the orientation of the others. I lifted my foot again and felt a wave of nausea roll through me. I hadn't turned around. I logged the time. 13:42. I forced myself to speak out loud, stating my name, my role, and my intention to return to the trail. Hearing my own voice grounded me, even though the sound seemed to fall flat, absorbed by the trees before it could travel more than a few yards. I chose a direction based on memory rather than the tracks. The prints could no longer be trusted, not even my own. I picked a line of travel using the slope of the ground, and the position of the sun. Faint though it was behind the clouds. Every step felt deliberate, exaggerated, like I was moving underwater. After several minutes, I stopped and looked back. The tracks behind me were normal. Heel behind toe. Orientation correct. Exactly what they should have been. Ahead of me, where I was walking toward. The prints were reversed again. The realization hit hard and fast. Whatever was happening wasn't following me. It was responding to direction. The ground itself seemed to decide how my movement would be recorded based on where I was trying to go. I stood there, heart pounding, and did the only thing that made sense in the moment. I turned around without moving forward. Just rotated in place, slow enough to feel each muscle shift. Then I took one careful step. The print was normal. Another step. Normal again. I took a third step, then stopped, afraid to push my luck. It wasn't a solution, but it was information. The anomaly was tied to intent, not position. I didn't understand how that could be true, but understanding wasn't a requirement for survival. Adaptation was. I continued moving backward, facing the direction I believed led out, but stepping as if I were returning deeper in. It was awkward and slow, but the prints stayed consistent. Normal orientation. My radio crackled faintly once, just a burst of static, then went dead again. As I moved, I became aware of another sensation. The forest felt closer. Not physically closing in, but attentive. I had the distinct impression of being observed without any clear source. I scanned the trees repeatedly, hand resting on the bare spray at my hip, though I knew that whatever I was dealing with didn't fit into any category I'd trained for. After what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 20 minutes, I found something that didn't belong. A scrap of blue fabric snagged on a low branch. I approached it cautiously, heart rate spiking. The color matched the backpacker's jacket, described in the report that morning. I examined the fabric closely. The tear was clean, straight, as if cut rather than ripped. No blood. No dirt. Just a neat slice through synthetic material. I followed the line of the branch down to the ground. There were footprints there. They were his. Same size, same tread, same overpronation, but they were layered strangely, overlapping in ways that suggested hesitation or confusion. Circles. Half steps. One foot pivoting without the other moving. This was the first time the tracks looked human since I'd left the trail. I felt a surge of grim relief. Whatever had happened, it hadn't erased him completely. He'd been here, disoriented, frightened. That meant he'd still been himself at this point. Then I noticed the direction of the prints. They formed a tight spiral, turning inward, each step angled slightly more than the last. No drag marks, no signs of collapse. Just controlled movement narrowing toward a center. Point about 6 feet across. In the middle of the spiral, there were no prints at all. Just bare soil, smoothed flat, as if something heavy had rested there, briefly before being lifted straight up. I didn't approach the center. Instead, I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the pattern, committing every detail to memory. My training told me to mark the location, call it in, wait for support. But my radio was useless, and the light was beginning to fail in earnest now. The forest darkened too quickly, shadows stretching unnaturally long between the trees. That was when I heard footsteps. Not behind me, not ahead, to my left, moving parallel to my path. I froze listening. The steps were careful, measured, matching my pace exactly. When I took one backward step, they did the same. When I stopped, they stopped. I called out, identifying myself clearly, asking if anyone needed assistance. My voice sounded thin, strained. There was no reply. I shifted direction slightly, testing. The footsteps adjusted immediately, maintaining the same distance. I still couldn't see anything, no movement, no shape between the trunks. Just the sound of someone walking on forest floor that should have been making more noise than it was. I realized then that I was no longer tracking the missing backpacker. Something was tracking me. The thought was calm, almost clinical. Fear had settled into something heavier, more controlled. I focused on mechanics. Distance, time, exit strategy. I continued my backward advance, increasing my pace slightly. The footsteps matched me again. I stopped abruptly. They took one more step after I did. A delayed response. That was a mistake. A small one, but enough to tell me I wasn't dealing with a mirror. Whatever was out there was approximating me, not copying perfectly. That meant it could be fooled. I changed direction suddenly, moving sideways instead of backward, stepping deliberately, unevenly. The footsteps hesitated, then resumed, the rhythm off now, a fraction too slow, a fraction too heavy. I caught a glimpse of movement between two trees. Not a body, not a face. Just a distortion, like heat shimmer, bending the air where something solid should have been. The ground beneath my feet shifted subtly, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was about to lose the orientation again. I stopped, turned slowly in place, and reoriented my intent before taking another step. By the time the first drops of freezing rain began to fall, I was exhausted, soaked with sweat and fear, and no closer to the trail than I'd been an hour earlier. And then I saw a familiar landmark. A fallen log, split down the middle by lightning years ago, its interior pale against the dark bark. I'd noted it on my way in that morning. Relief surged through me so hard it almost knocked me off my feet. I moved toward it, forward now, confident enough to risk it. The footsteps to my left stopped. When I reached the log, I placed a hand on it, grounding myself in its rough texture. I turned to look back into the forest. There were no tracks beside mine anymore. Only one set of reversed footprints, starting at the base of the log and leading away into the trees. They were my size. I didn't follow the reversed tracks. That decision probably saved my life. I stood there for several seconds, hands still resting on the lightning-split log, forcing myself not to react instinctively. Every part of my training screamed that those prints represented movement, information, a story that needed to be read. But something deeper, older than training, told me that those tracks were not evidence anymore. They were an invitation. The freezing rain intensified, needles of ice tapping against my jacket and the exposed skin of my face. The temperature dropped fast enough that my breath fogged heavily in front of me. I logged the time again. 16s and 18. Less than 2 hours until full dark. I turned my back on the reversed prints and moved the way I knew the trail had to be. Not by memory alone, but by terrain logic. The slope angled down toward the drainage basin. The trail ran parallel to it before switchbacking north. I moved carefully, deliberately, refusing to look back again, no matter how strong the urge became. The forest resisted me. Not physically, but perceptually. Distances felt stretched. Trees that should have taken seconds to reach seemed to drift farther away the closer I got. My sense of direction wavered, compass needle trembling instead of settling. I stopped using it after the third time it spun a full circle without slowing. I focused on tactile reality instead. The weight of my pack, the sting of rain on my knuckles, the sound of my own breathing. Every step was intentional. I did not hurry. Hurrying leads to mistakes. Somewhere behind me, something moved. I didn't hear footsteps this time. I heard breathing. It wasn't close enough to feel, but it was close enough to recognize the cadence. Too slow. Too controlled. Not labored by cold or exertion. It matched my pauses perfectly. When I stopped, it stopped. When I started again, it resumed after a brief delay, like it needed time to decide. I refused to acknowledge it. I remembered the missing backpacker's spiral of prints. The way his steps had narrowed inward, controlled but wrong. I wondered how long he'd walked like this before he realized he wasn't alone anymore. I wondered if he'd tried to follow his own tracks out. The rain turned to sleet. Ice built on the branches overhead, shedding in small showers that rattled against the forest floor. Light faded into a dull blue, gray that flattened everything into silhouettes. Then, finally, impossibly, I saw the trail. It appeared between two stands of fir, like it had always been there, packed dirt bordered by low stones, familiar and mundane. I almost laughed. The relief was so sudden and overwhelming it made my legs weak. I stepped onto it without hesitation. Nothing happened. The ground felt solid. Normal. The air shifted, the forest sounds returning all at once. Wind, distant creaks, the faint chatter of something small moving through brush. I took 3 more steps, then 5, then 10, each one easing the tension wound tight inside my chest. The breathing stopped. I didn't turn around until I reached the first trail marker post. I leaned against it, chest heaving, and finally allowed myself to look back. The forest edge was still. No movement, no distortion, no reverse tracks spilling onto the trail behind me. Just trees. I didn't waste the moment. I keyed my radio again, and this time it came to life instantly, voices overlapping as my signal cut through. I identified myself, gave my location, and requested immediate extraction support. My voice shook despite my best efforts, but it carried. I followed the trail at a steady pace, refusing to run. Running would imply fear, and fear felt like something that could be used against me. As I moved, I scanned the ground constantly, checking my own prints. They were normal. Heel to toe. Correct orientation. Human. I reached the trailhead just after nightfall. The deputies and ranger were already there. Relief plain on their faces when they saw me emerge from the trees alone. They asked questions immediately, but I waved them off until I was safely inside one of the vehicles, heater blasting against the cold that had finally settled into my bones. Once I was stable, I gave my report. I told them everything: the directional anomaly, the reverse tracks, the spiral, the presence that mirrored my movement imperfectly. I kept my language precise, factual, stripped of speculation. I showed them the photographs, the measurements, the timestamps. They listened without interrupting. When I finished, the ranger asked a single question. "Did you find any sign of the backpacker after the spiral?" I shook my head. They searched for 3 more days. They found the scrap of blue fabric. They found the spiral. They found my boot prints leading to the trail and stopping cleanly at the log. They did not find any sign of him beyond that point. No body, no gear, no indication of predation or accident. The official conclusion was exposure, combined with disorientation, likely compounded by weather and terrain. My notes about the footprints were archived but quietly dismissed as misinterpretation under stress. No one said it outright, but the implication was clear. I had seen what I expected to see. I resigned from volunteer tracking less than a month later. I still hike. I still walk trails. I still know how to read the ground. But I follow one rule now, without exception. If I ever see footprints that don't turn when the world turns beneath them, I don't try to understand them. I turn around before the ground decides which way I'm allowed to leave. My name is Thomas Keegan. I am writing this as a formal account of my final day, working seasonal maintenance in a national forest in the Pacific Northwest. A day that began like every other and ended with information I was never meant to notice. I was hired on a temporary contract to repair footbridges, clear storm debris, service trailhead signage, and assist rangers with non-emergency tasks during peak hiking season. It was not a position that came with authority, only access. Access to maintenance logs, closed trail maps, ranger radios when needed, and the kind of quiet familiarity with the land that comes from spending long days alone with tools and trees. That morning started before sunrise. I woke in my assigned bunkhouse, a narrow building tucked behind the ranger station, where the walls always smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old paper. The radio on the desk crackled with routine traffic, weather updates, a reminder about a bear sighting near the eastern boundary. Nothing unusual. I remember checking my phone before heading out and noticing that my GPS app still showed yesterday's trail route, a thin blue line looping in a place I didn't remember walking. I dismissed it as a glitch and shoved the phone back into my pocket. My task list was simple. I was to drive out to a lesser used service road, hike a short distance to inspect a damaged trail marker, and then swing by a closed trailhead to remove outdated missing person flyers. That last part wasn't officially assigned. I volunteered for it after noticing how many of those notices had accumulated over the weeks. Faces printed on weather-warped paper. Dates written in marker, all slowly dissolving into the wood they were stapled to. It felt wrong to leave them there once the cases were transferred out of active search. The drive was quiet, fog clinging low between the trees. When I parked and started hiking, the forest felt ordinary in the way it always had. Damp earth, distant birds, the rhythmic crunch of boots on gravel. I fixed the trail marker in less than an hour. It had been twisted by a fallen branch. The arrow bent, just enough to point a few degrees off the trail. I straightened it, tightened the bolts, and took a photo for the maintenance log. That was when I noticed something odd in the paperwork app on my phone. The maintenance photo automatically tagged a set of GPS coordinates. As expected. What caught my attention was the list of recent uploads below it, entries from other crews. Several of them had identical coordinates attached, despite being labeled as work completed miles apart. Bridge repairs, culvert inspections, trail closures. Same numbers repeated again and again. At first I assumed it was a sensing error. Bad satellite signal, maybe. I continued on to the closed trailhead. The gate was locked, the sign faded. 3 missing person flyers were stapled to the board. I removed them carefully, folding each one before placing it in my pack. As I worked, I noticed something that made me pause. Each flyer listed a last known GPS location, and each of those coordinates matched the same set I had just seen in the maintenance logs. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the numbers. Degrees, minutes, seconds. Precise. Too precise to be coincidence. These people hadn't gone missing together. Different dates, different trails, different backgrounds. Yet the reports all ended at the same point on the map. Back at my truck, I sat with the engine off and pulled up the coordinates manually. The map loaded slowly, then centered on a spot deep within the forest, far from marked trails. No name. No designation. Just green terrain and contour lines. According to the map, it was an unremarkable patch of land. According to the reports, it was where people stopped existing as traceable entities. I radioed the ranger station and asked, as casually as I could, whether there had been issues with GPS logging lately. The response was immediate and oddly firm. No issues reported. I was told to finish my assigned tasks and return before dark. The tone stuck with me. It wasn't irritation. It was caution. I decided, without fully acknowledging the decision, to drive closer to the coordinates. I justified it as curiosity, as something I could glance at from a distance. The service roads branched like veins, some clearly used, others nearly reclaimed by moss. My truck couldn't get me all the way there, but it brought me closer than any marked trail did. When I started walking again, the forest changed in subtle ways. The air felt heavier, as if sound didn't travel as far. My GPS signal fluctuated, the map rotating slightly even when I stood still. I checked my compass more than once, each time confirming I was headed in the right direction. I reached the coordinates just after midday. There was nothing dramatic about the location. No clearing, no structure, no signpost. Just a dense stand of trees and a shallow depression in the ground, like the earth had settled unevenly. Leaves lay thicker there, undisturbed, despite no wind. My phone buzzed as I stepped closer, the GPS locking firmly onto the point. For the first time all day, it stopped drifting. I felt an urge to document the site, to take photos, notes, anything that would justify being there. But as I raised my phone, the screen dimmed, then went black. Not dead, unresponsive. I tried the radio next, static, followed by a brief burst of noise that sounded almost like overlapping voices, then silence. That was when I noticed the footprints. They weren't fresh. Some were partially filled with debris, others barely visible impressions pressed into the soil. Different sizes, different tread patterns. All of them pointed inward toward the depression. None led away. I backed up slowly, every sense sharpening. My training told me to mark the location and leave. My instincts told me I was already involved. As I turned to retrace my steps, I realized the forest behind me didn't look the same. Trees that should have been familiar landmarks seemed shifted, their spacing subtly wrong. I checked my watch. Only 20 minutes had passed since I arrived. I started walking, then stopped when I realized my GPS, briefly flickering back to life, was still marking me at the same coordinates. No matter how far I moved, the numbers didn't change. By the time I understood that leaving wasn't as simple as turning around, the forest had gone completely silent. I tried to stay calm. That was the first and only thing I did right after realizing the GPS coordinates weren't changing. I told myself it was a software error, maybe a corrupted cache caused by poor signal under dense canopy. I restarted the phone. Nothing. The screen came back on, bright and clear. Battery nearly full, but the map still pinned me to that same point as if I hadn't moved an inch. I took 10 deliberate steps north, counting them out loud. The forest floor dipped slightly, then rose. My boots crunched over gravel. I stopped, held the phone out in front of me, and watched the coordinates remain identical. I remember a cold pressure settling behind my eyes, not fear exactly, but the sensation of standing too close to something I didn't understand. I switched to my compass again. The needle wavered, then steadied. North was north. That at least still made sense. I began walking in that direction, focusing on physical cues instead of digital ones. Broken branch, pale lichen on a cedar trunk, a fallen log with exposed roots. I marked them mentally, building a path backward in my head. After several minutes, I stopped and turned around. Everything I had just passed looked unfamiliar. The log was gone. The cedar with pale lichen was there, but its markings were different. The pattern shifted, like it belonged to another tree entirely. Panic rose then, sharp and undeniable. I called out, my voice sounding wrong in the air, muffled and thin. No echo, no response. I forced myself to breathe slowly and reached for the radio again. This time, when I pressed the transmit button, it didn't stay silent. I heard a burst of static, followed by a calm male voice I didn't recognize, speaking in a measured, professional tone. Confirm your coordinates. I nearly cried with relief. I responded immediately, reading the numbers straight off my phone. There was a pause. Too long. Repeat, the voice said. I repeated them. Same pause. Thomas, the voice said, and my stomach dropped because I hadn't given my name. You need to stop moving. I'm lost, I said. My GPS is frozen. I think You're not lost, the voice interrupted. You're exactly where you shouldn't be. The transmission cut out before I could respond. I stood there, radio pressed to my ear, listening to nothing but my own breathing. I tried again. No signal, just dead air. I did what any rational person would do when technology fails and instincts betray them. I sat down. I drank water. I took inventory. Backpack intact. Food for the day. Headlamp, emergency whistle. Everything I'd carried into the forest was still with me. That helped ground me, if only slightly. As I sat there, something else became clear. The forest wasn't static. It wasn't rearranging itself dramatically. Not like in stories. It was subtler than that. The spacing between trees shifted when I wasn't looking. Shadows fell at angles that didn't match the sun's position. The longer I stayed still, the more it felt like the environment was waiting for me to make a decision. I stood up and chose a direction at random, then committed to it fully. I walked without stopping, ignoring the GPS, ignoring the rising sense of wrongness. After what felt like an hour, I broke into a small clearing. In the center was a rusted metal object half buried in leaves. At first I thought it was debris, maybe an old trail sign or a piece of equipment left behind decades ago. As I got closer, I recognized it as a survey marker, the kind used for long-term land measurements. I'd seen them before, though rarely this far off trail. This one had been modified. Attached to the metal post were strips of plastic, laminated paper, and fabric, all tied on with fading cord. I knelt and examined them one by one. They were fragments of missing person flyers. Names, photos, dates, each one weathered, some nearly illegible, but unmistakable. Someone had collected them and left them here deliberately. At the base of the post was a notebook sealed in a plastic bag. My hands shook as I opened it. The pages inside were covered in neat handwriting, careful and consistent, as if written by someone determined to remain calm. The entries were maintenance logs. Dates, tasks, trail numbers, names of seasonal workers, rangers, volunteers. The handwriting changed occasionally, but the format stayed the same. Each entry ended with a set of GPS coordinates. The same ones. The final entry stopped mid-sentence. No date, just a name I recognized immediately. A ranger who had trained me during my first week. Officially transferred out after a family emergency. Unofficially, no one talked about him. I heard movement then. Not footsteps, not quite. More like the sound of leaves settling under weight that wasn't fully there. I stood slowly, scanning the clearing. Nothing visible, but the sense of being observed intensified, pressing in from all sides. I spoke without thinking. "I'm leaving," the forest responded. Not with sound, but with motion. The clearing seemed to stretch, the trees at its edge pulling back, just enough to suggest an exit path. I didn't question it. I followed, heart pounding. Every instinct screaming that compliance was safer than resistance. The path led downhill into a narrow ravine. The air grew cooler, damp. My GPS flickered again, briefly showing distance traveled before snapping back to zero. I stumbled once, catching myself on a rock slick with moss. At the bottom of the ravine was another depression, larger than the first. The ground there was bare, stripped of leaves, as if something had passed through repeatedly. Around its edge were more footprints, overlapping layers of them. Some so old they'd nearly eroded away. I understood then what the coordinates represented. They weren't a point where people disappeared. They were a point where people arrived. My radio crackled again. Same calm voice. "You can still walk out," it said. "But you have to do exactly what I tell you." I asked the only question that mattered. Why didn't anyone warn me? There was a long pause. Then, because warning people draws attention. And attention makes it harder to contain. I was told to step back. Slowly, to keep my eyes on the ground. To follow the compass, not the path. To ignore anything that tried to correct me. As I did, I felt it. A pressure behind me, like standing too close to a drop-off. The forest seemed to lean inward, branches bending slightly, leaves trembling without wind. I walked until my legs burned, and my throat ached from shallow breathing. When I finally broke free of the ravine, the light had changed. late afternoon edging toward evening. My GPS suddenly updated, coordinates jumping wildly before settling somewhere familiar. I didn't stop until I reached the service road. I didn't look back. When I returned to the station, no one asked where I'd been. My radio was taken without comment. The missing person flyers were removed from my pack and placed in a sealed box. I was told my contract had ended early. Transportation was arranged for the next morning. That night, lying awake in the bunkhouse, I checked my phone one last time. A new maintenance entry had sensed while I was offline. My name, today's date, and a set of GPS coordinates. I didn't sleep. I lay on the narrow bunk staring at the ceiling, listening to the building settle and the distant hum of the generator cycling on and off. Every time my eyes closed, I saw the depression in the ground, the way the leaves thinned, as if something had brushed them aside again and again. I kept my phone face down on the desk, afraid to look at it and more afraid not to. Sometime after midnight, the radio on the desk turned on by itself. No static this time. No preamble. Just the same calm voice, lower now, almost tired. You need to delete the entry. I sat up slowly, heart hammering. I don't have access to the system anymore. A pause. You still have the device? I reached for my phone. The screen lit immediately, as if it had been waiting. The maintenance app was open. The new entry highlighted. My name, today's date. The coordinates blinking faintly, like a cursor. I didn't submit this, I said, though I wasn't sure who I was saying it for. Note the voice agreed. But it was logged. I scrolled. There was an option to amend entries, buried behind a permissions warning. I tapped it. A message appeared, simple and direct. Lokat ian fiaram atiawan raku irati. Can't confirm a location I'm not at, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. When the voice returned, it sounded closer, as if the speaker were standing just outside the bunkhouse. You are at it, he said. You just don't feel it yet. The lights flickered. Outside, the wind picked up suddenly, rattling the thin windows. I checked the time. 20:17 a.m. The same time listed on several of the missing person reports I'd handled over the summer. I remembered thinking it was a coincidence then. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The forest around the station looked normal. But normal had lost its meaning. The shadows between trees seemed deeper than they should be. The service road stretched away in both directions. Empty. My GPS app opened without prompting. The map centered not on the station, but on the coordinates. They were no longer deep in the forest. They were here. I felt it then. A subtle pressure under my feet, like standing on a thin layer of ice over dark water. The ground wasn't moving, but it felt wrong, as if the concept of had loosened its grip. Why me? I asked the night. Why seasonal maintenance? The radio crackled in my pocket. Because you noticed. Because you had access without authority. Because you were temporary. I understood with a clarity that made my hands shake. Permanent staff rotated. Policies changed. But seasonal workers came and went, their names easy to file away, their departures unremarkable. We were perfect witnesses because we were never expected to remember. I'm leaving in the morning, I said. You said I could walk out?
Yes,
the voice said. But the entry can't. I looked down at my phone again. The confirm button pulsed softly. What happens if I don't? I asked. There was no immediate answer. When it came, it wasn't through the radio. It was behind me. Not a voice exactly. more like the sensation of words forming just out of reach, pressing against the back of my skull. Images followed: the depression in the forest, the survey marker, the ravine, overlapping footprints. People arriving, not all at once, but one by one, guided by chance, by curiosity, by error. Guided by coordinates that didn't mark a place so much as a condition. I stumbled forward, gasping, the pressure lifting as soon as I moved. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew there was nothing to see, nothing that could be captured by sight. I ran. The station door slammed shut behind me as I burst inside. I locked it, though I didn't know what I thought that would accomplish. The radio fell silent. My phone vibrated once, then stopped. I sat on the floor until dawn, back against the wall, phone clutched in both hands. When morning came, it came all at once. Sunlight spilled through the trees. Birds returned. The forest reset itself with unsettling efficiency. At 7:00 a.m. on the dot, a government vehicle pulled into the lot. 2 people stepped out. Both wore plain field jackets with no visible insignia. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't ask how I was feeling. One of them held a tablet. The other carried a sealed equipment case. "You're scheduled to depart," the one with the tablet said. "We'll need your phone." I handed it over. My fingers felt numb. "Before I go," I said, "I want to know something." He looked up. "Ask." "Does it stop if no one logs it?" He considered that for a moment. "It slows," he said. "Places like that don't disappear. They accumulate." The other one opened the equipment case and removed a handheld device I didn't recognize. He pressed it briefly against my phone. The screen flashed, then went dark. "The entry's been archived," the first man said. "You won't be listed as missing." "And the coordinates, they'll appear again," he said. "They always do. I was driven out of the forest without ceremony. No exit interview. No paperwork. By the time the road straightened and the trees thinned, my phone buzzed to life again. No signal. No apps open. Just a single notification from the maintenance system. NTROCLOCD. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. Weeks later at home, I woke in the middle of the night with that same pressure behind my eyes. I checked the time. 20:17 a.m. My phone lay on the nightstand, screen lit. A map was open. The coordinates were different now. Not the forest. Somewhere closer. Somewhere I recognized. I turned the phone face down and didn't touch it again. I'm writing this because I know what happens when people stop noticing patterns. When numbers repeat and no one asks why. If you work somewhere remote and you see the same coordinates appear again and again, don't go looking for the place. It isn't lost. It's waiting. My name is Aaron Whitlock. I am a commissioned backcountry ranger employed by the State Park Service, and until recently, I was assigned to oversee Pine Hollow Trail, a narrow but heavily trafficked route that cuts through a low, elevation forest basin known for its dense canopy, poor radio reception, and a history of minor navigation incidents. I have worked in wilderness management for 11 years. I have logged over 6,000 hours in remote patrol, search coordination, and solo monitoring. I am not prone to exaggeration, superstition, or panic. What I am about to recount occurred over the course of a single operational day, and every detail I describe is accurate to the best of my memory. At the time of the incident, 7 hikers had gone missing along the same 2-mile stretch of Pine Hollow Trail in less than 30 days. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. Solo or paired hikers, experienced, properly equipped, last confirmed by trail cameras or cell pings within the corridor between mile markers 3.4 and 5.6. No signs of struggle. No recovered gear. No emergency calls. No deviation detected by GPS data before the signal ceased. The trail itself is not technically demanding. No cliff exposure. No fast water crossings. No known predators large enough to account for 7 vanishings without leaving evidence. Because of this, the park administration reassigned personnel, closed adjacent routes, and placed me on a temporary continuous monitoring detail. I began my shift at 05 and 10 hours. Weather was stable. Overcast, low wind, temperature just above freezing. I logged in at the Pine Hollow Ranger Outpost, conducted a routine equipment check, and verified that the trail cameras, pressure sensors, and radio repeaters were operational. All systems reported normal status. I was alone. That was intentional. The directive was to limit variables. At 06:02, I entered the trailhead on foot, heading northbound. The forest in Pine Hollow is unusually quiet even under normal conditions. The tree growth is dense enough to muffle wind, and the ground cover absorbs sound. Still, that morning felt quieter than it should have. No birdsong. No insect noise. Just my boots, my breath, and the faint creak of my pack straps. I noted it mentally but did not assign meaning to it. By 07:11, I reached mile marker 3.4. This is where the disappearances began. I paused, documented conditions, and checked the nearest camera. The housing was intact. The lens was clear. The internal timestamp was correct. However, the last recorded clip was from 3 days prior. Despite the system showing uninterrupted power, that discrepancy bothered me. But equipment failure was not unheard of in the hollow. I continued forward. The trail between 3.4 and 5.6 is deceptively uniform. No branching paths, no elevation change worth noting. Yet, within 15 minutes, I began to experience a subtle but persistent sense of disorientation. My compass readings remained steady. My GPS coordinates matched expected progression, and still my perception of distance felt distorted. Steps stretched longer than usual. Time seemed to compress. I found myself checking my watch repeatedly, convinced more minutes had passed than the display indicated. At 08:03, I encountered the first anomaly. There was a boot print in the center of the trail, fresh, sharply defined in the soft soil. It faced backward, toward the trailhead. That alone was not unusual. What unsettled me was that it was the only print. No leading impressions. No trailing sequence. Just one print, perfectly formed. As if someone had stepped down, paused, and vanished upward. I photographed it, measured it, and logged it. Standard procedure. Still, my hands shook slightly as I did so. By 09:17, my radio began to crackle with intermittent static. I attempted a routine check-in with base. No response. I tried again on the emergency frequency. Silence. According to protocol, I should have turned back at that point. I did not. I told myself the repeater interference was environmental. I told myself I had a job to finish. At 10:26, I reached mile marker 5.6, the point where all 7 hikers were last confirmed. I expected relief. Instead, I felt an abrupt, overwhelming reluctance to step past the marker. It was not fear in the traditional sense. It was more like standing at the edge of a conversation you are not meant to overhear. The forest beyond the marker looked identical to what lay behind me, yet my body reacted as though I had reached a boundary. I crossed it anyway. Almost immediately, I heard footsteps. They matched my cadence exactly. When I stopped, they stopped. When I turned, there was nothing behind me. The trail remained empty, straight, unobstructed. I called out, identified myself, and received no reply. My voice sounded wrong in that space, thin and quickly absorbed. At 11:04, I found a backpack lying just off the trail. It was clean, no signs of weathering. Inside were standard supplies, neatly packed. Food unopened, water full. Phone powered off, battery intact. The owner's identification matched one of the missing hikers. According to the reports, this pack had not been recovered during prior searches. It should not have been there. As I stood over it, the forest around me seemed to lean inward. Not physically, but perceptually, as if my field of view was narrowing. My breathing became shallow. I had the sudden, irrational certainty that if I stayed still too long, something would complete an action it had already started. At 12:19, I made the decision to return to the outpost. The moment I turned around, the sensation lifted slightly, like pressure easing. But as I retraced my steps, I realized the trail was subtly different. Rocks I remembered stepping over were gone. Fallen branches had shifted position. My GPS showed movement, yet the distance counter barely changed. At 13:47, I passed mile marker 3.4 again, or what appeared to be it. The number was scratched into the metal instead of stamped. The surrounding trees were younger, thinner. I checked my watch. Only 2 hours had passed since I'd last been there. That was impossible. By 14:30, my radio came back online on its own. A single transmission broke through the static. It was my own voice, reading the morning check, in log word for word, including phrases I distinctly remembered thinking, but not saying aloud. That was when I started running. I emerged from the trailhead at 16:02 hours. According to my watch, I had been inside Pine Hollow for just under 11 hours. According to the outpost clock, I had been gone for 3. This is where my official report ends. What follows, in the next part, is why Pine Hollow Trail is no longer monitored, why the missing hikers were never found, and why I am no longer employed as a ranger. I did not leave the park after exiting the trailhead. That detail matters. Standard protocol would have required me to stand down, submit to medical evaluation, and surrender my field equipment. I did none of those things. I told the duty officer I needed to complete a written incident addendum at the outpost before end of day cutoff. My voice was steady. My credentials were valid. No one questioned it. I returned to the Pine Hollow Ranger outpost at 16:18 hours. The building is a single-room structure, elevated on short stilts with a steel, reinforced door, one observation window, and a communications console hardwired to the park network. I locked the door behind me out of habit, not fear. At that moment, I still believed what I'd experienced could be explained by fatigue, stress, or equipment malfunction. I wanted documentation. I wanted something concrete to anchor the day. Inside, everything appeared normal. The wall clock matched my watch. The generator hum was steady. The logbook lay open on the desk where I had left it that morning. I sat down, removed my pack, and began typing my report. At 16:41, I noticed something missing. The recovered backpack was no longer with me. I am certain I carried it out of the forest. I remember the weight of it. I remember setting it beside my chair. Yet the space at my feet was empty. I stood, searched the outpost, checked outside beneath the stilts, even scanned the surrounding tree line through binoculars. Nothing. No disturbed soil, no tracks, no explanation. When I returned inside, the logbook on the desk had changed. A new entry had been added beneath my morning check-in. The handwriting matched mine exactly. Same pressure, same spacing, same slight slant to the left on capital letters. The timestamp read 11:58 hours. According to that entry, I had concluded the trail patrol early due to environmental redundancy and recommended suspension of monitoring pending further review. I had no memory of writing it. More concerning was that the phrasing used terminology I rarely employed, words I associated with internal memos, not field logs. I did not erase it. At 17:06 the trail camera feeds activated on the console display. I had not requested them. The screens cycled through the numbered cameras, positioned along Pine Hollow Trail. Most showed empty forest, static and grainy in the low light. Then camera 4 came into view. The timestamp read Tundra 32 hours. The angle was wrong. Camera 4 was mounted facing northbound traffic. The figure on screen was walking south toward the trailhead. He wore my uniform, my pack, my gait. The image quality was poor, but when he stopped and turned his head slightly, I saw my face. I shut the feed down immediately. The console went dark for several seconds longer than it should have, then rebooted on its own. When the screens came back, the cameras showed nothing but still forest again. At 17:22, the radio crackled. "Aaron," a voice said. It was not distorted, no static, no delay. It sounded as if the speaker were standing just outside the outpost door. I did not respond. "Aaron," the voice repeated, closer somehow. "You missed the turn." My hand moved toward the radio before I consciously decided to stop it. I stood frozen, listening. There were no footsteps outside. No shadows crossed the window. The forest beyond remained perfectly still. At 17:39, the pressure sensors along the trail corridor triggered in sequence, starting at mile marker 5.6 and moving southbound. The readouts indicated a single human-sized presence walking at a steady pace. The speed matched my average petrol cadence. The estimated arrival time at the trailhead was 18:04 hours. I barricaded the door. I used the steel cabinet, the spare water drums, anything with weight. This was not protocol. Rangers are trained to assist, not isolate. Still, every instinct told me that whatever was moving down that trail was not someone I could help. At 18:01, the outpost lights flickered. At 18:03, the pressure sensors stopped triggering. At 18:04, someone knocked on the door. 3 slow knocks, deliberate, measured. Exactly the way I knock when approaching an occupied structure. "Aaron," the voice said again, this time muffled by the steel door. "Open up. You left something behind." I backed away until my shoulders hit the far wall. My heart rate was so loud I was certain it could be heard through the door. I said nothing. The handle turned. The door did not open. The barricade held. On the other side, the handle was tested gently, as if the person turning it already knew it wouldn't work. "That's not how it happened," the voice said softly. "You didn't run." I slid down the wall and covered my ears, but the words continued, not louder, not quieter, simply present. "You stopped at the marker. You listened. You understood." At 18:17, the knocking ceased. The sensors did not react. The forest outside remained silent. I stayed where I was until 19:02, when my radio chirped with an incoming transmission from base. A routine welfare check. They asked me to confirm status. I answered. My voice sounded wrong to my own ears, strained and distant, but they acknowledged it as normal. They did not mention the trail activity. At 19:31, I opened the outpost door. The trailhead beyond was empty. No footprints, no signs of approach or retreat. But resting against the bottom step of the outpost stairs was the missing backpack. Inside it was something new. A folded map of Pine Hollow Trail, annotated in red ink. The markings did not follow the official route. They curved inward, looping through the forest in tight spirals, all converging on a single point between mile markers 4.1 and 4.2. At the center of the spiral was a note, written in my handwriting. This is where we stayed. I did not sleep that night. What happened after sunset, and what I found when I returned to that point the next time, is why there is no part 3 in the official record, only the one I am writing now. I remained in the outpost until first light, sitting upright with my back against the wall opposite the door, my service weapon unloaded and resting on the desk where I could see it. I did not trust my hands to keep it steady. Every few minutes I checked the clock, the radio, the window, then the clock again. Nothing moved outside. Nothing spoke. The forest held its breath with me. At 05:02 hours, the park transitioned into morning operations. I heard distant vehicle engines on the service road. Normal sounds returned gradually. Birds, wind through the canopy. The faint mechanical whine of the generator cycling load. By all observable measures, Pine Hollow had reset itself. That was the most unsettling part at 0541. I filed a brief continuation report, stating that I intended to revisit the interior section of the trail to verify sensor integrity. I did not mention the backpack, the map, or the voice. I knew how it would sound. More importantly, I knew I would be stopped if I said too much. I needed to see the marked point. While it was still daylight, and while whatever had followed me had not yet decided what to do next. I entered the trail at 06:07. Everything looked ordinary. The same soil, the same trees, the same mile markers, now stamped correctly, their numbers clean and unaltered. My GPS behaved normally. My watch advanced in steady increments. I almost convinced myself the previous day had been a stress-induced distortion. Almost. When I reached mile marker 4.1, the forest changed. There was no visible boundary. No shift in terrain or light. But the air felt heavier, as if sound itself had more resistance. My footsteps dulled. My breathing sounded too loud inside my own head. I slowed involuntarily, each step taken with the careful hesitation of someone approaching thin ice. At 4.2, I found the place from the map. It was not a clearing. It was not a landmark. It was a shallow depression in the ground, a shallow basin no more than 15 feet across, ringed by trees that leaned inward at slight, unnatural angles. The undergrowth within the basin was sparse, the soil compacted smooth, as if something had stood there repeatedly for a very long time. I knew, without understanding how, that this was where the trail bent when no one was watching. I stepped into the basin at 07:03. The forest went silent. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of attention. I had the overwhelming sensation of being observed from every direction at once, not by eyes, but by awareness. Memories surfaced unbidden. Moments from the previous day I could not fully recall, fragments of standing still, of listening, of feeling something align itself with my presence. I understood then what the hikers had done wrong. They had not been taken. They had stayed. The hollow does not remove people. It mirrors them, holds them in place, lets them continue walking a version of the trail that folds inward instead of forward. A closed loop of intention and attention. Those who pause too long, who listen instead of moving on, leave something behind that continues without them. At 07:19, I heard my footsteps again. They approached from behind, slow and deliberate. I did not turn. I kept my eyes on the ground, on my boots, on the edge of the basin. I remembered the voice saying I hadn't run. I remembered the certainty that staying still completed something. So I did the opposite. I spoke. "I'm leaving," I said, aloud, clearly, without anger or fear. "I don't belong here." The footsteps stopped. The pressure in the air increased, a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders, my spine, my lungs. For a brief moment, I felt a powerful urge to remain, to stand exactly where I was and let the trail finish its work. Instead, I stepped backward out of the basin. The silence broke instantly. Birds called, wind moved, the forest exhaled. Behind me, there were no footprints. I did not run. I walked steadily, deliberately, never stopping, never looking back. My radio crackled once, as if testing itself, then went quiet. The rest of the trail passed without incident. I exited Pine Hollow Trail at 09s in 12 hours. At 10:30, I turned in my badge and submitted my resignation. I cited personal reasons. No one argued. The park superintendent looked relieved, though he tried to hide it. He told me the trail would be closed indefinitely due to geological instability. No further searches would be conducted. The missing hikers would be reclassified as presumed deceased. Before I left the outpost for the final time, I checked the logbook. A new entry had been added beneath the one I hadn't written. Monitoring concluded. Subject released. The handwriting was mine. I did not take the book with me. I did not take anything from Pine Hollow. I drove until the forest thinned, and the road widened, and the sense of being followed finally faded into the ordinary unease of memory. Pine Hollow Trail remains closed. Sometimes, when I wake in the early hours of the morning, I am certain I can hear footsteps matching my breathing, just out of sync enough to be noticed. When that happens, I do not listen. I get up. I move. I remind myself that leaving is an action, not a location. 7 hikers are still missing, and somewhere between mile markers 4.1 and 4.2, something that walks like me is still finishing its patrol. My name is Lucas Brenner. I am 32 years old, and until last fall, I believed I understood my younger brother better than anyone else. Evan was 24, methodical, cautious to the point of irritation. He triple-checked maps, logged mileage in a notebook, and texted me trail coordinates, even when he knew I was busy at work. When he decided to take a solo camping trip, it wasn't impulsive. He had planned it for weeks. He chose a state forest he'd visited twice before, a familiar loop trail that rarely saw traffic after summer ended. He told me he would be gone for 3 nights, and back by Sunday afternoon. He promised to check in every evening, even though the signal there was unreliable. Saturday night came and went without a message. That alone didn't alarm me. Evan had warned me that coverage dropped out in certain valleys. I expected to hear from him Sunday morning, when that didn't happen either. A dull pressure settled behind my eyes, the kind you ignore by telling yourself you're overreacting. By Sunday evening, when his phone went straight to voicemail, I drove to the ranger station myself. They officially listed him as overdue by Monday morning. By noon, a small search party had formed: 2 rangers, a volunteer tracker, a pair of local SAR members, and me. I signed the waiver with a hand that felt disconnected from my body, like I was watching someone else write my name. The air that day was cold but clear, the kind of early autumn weather that tricks you into thinking nothing bad can happen under such a blue sky. We started at Evan's registered campsite, His car was still parked where he'd left it, locked, undisturbed. A thin layer of pine needles collecting along the windshield wipers. The campsite itself looked orderly at first glance. His tent was still standing, rainfly secured, stakes driven cleanly into the ground. His pack lay just inside the vestibule, zipped shut. That detail bothered me immediately. He even never left his pack unattended like that. If he went even a short distance from camp, he took it with him. One of the rangers suggested he might have gone for a short hike and gotten turned around. I nodded, because that explanation sounded reasonable enough to cling to. But as I stepped closer to the tent, I noticed something else. The ground around the campsite was marked with footprints, more than I expected. Evan's boots had a distinctive tread. Wide lugs with a chipped edge on the right heel. I recognized them instantly. But mixed in with them were other prints, overlapping, circling the site in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. I pointed them out. The volunteer tracker crouched, studied them, and frowned. He said little, just that there appeared to be at least 2 distinct sets. The rangers exchanged a look that lasted half a second too long. No one said the word other, but it hovered there, unspoken. We followed Evan's trail first. His footprints led away from camp toward the main loop, steady and evenly spaced. For the first half-mile, everything looked normal. Broken twigs at knee height where he'd brushed past, scuffed dirt where he'd stopped to adjust his pack. Then, gradually, the pattern changed. His stride shortened. His steps began to veer, not enough to suggest panic, but enough to suggest distraction. I found myself remembering the way Evan used to walk as a kid when he thought someone was following him home from school, pretending not to notice while checking reflections in store windows. About an hour into the search, the tracker stopped and raised a hand. He pointed to a cluster of impressions off the side of the trail. Another set of footprints, parallel to Evan's, matching his pace but offset by several feet, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. They weren't fresh. Leaves had settled into them, but not completely. Whoever made them had been there at roughly the same time. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Another hiker, someone who had passed through earlier. But the way the prints mirrored Evan's path unsettled me. They weren't cutting across the trail or overtaking him. They were shadowing him. As the afternoon wore on, we found more signs. Scratches on tree bark at shoulder height, not deep enough to be animal marks. A broken branch woven into another, deliberately bent and left hanging. Once, we found a small stack of stones just off the trail, arranged in a way that looked intentional but meaningless, like a signal without a code. No one spoke much after that. The forest itself seemed to close in, the canopy thickening until the light dimmed to a perpetual dusk. Every sound felt amplified. The crunch of boots, the distant tap of woodpeckers, the sigh of wind through needles. I caught myself turning my head at the faintest rustle, expecting to see someone standing just beyond the tree line. Near mid-afternoon, we reached a narrow ravine where the trail dipped sharply before climbing again. The ground there was damp, perfect for holding impressions. Evan's footprints descended, paused at the bottom, then climbed the opposite bank. The second set followed, closer now, overlapping in places. Then, abruptly, Evan's prints changed direction. He had stepped off the trail and into the brush. The ranger leading us hesitated. Off-trail movement made searches more complicated, but it was still within protocol. We followed, pushing through undergrowth that snagged at our clothes. That was when I noticed the pattern that made my stomach drop. Every time Evan's trail deviated sharply, the other set anticipated it. The follower wasn't reacting. They were predicting. We found Evan's notebook just before sunset. It lay open on a fallen log, pages fluttering slightly in the breeze. I recognized his handwriting immediately. Tight, precise, always slanted slightly to the right. The last entries were different. The lines wavered. The words crowded together, as if he'd been writing quickly. I wasn't supposed to read it. One of the rangers reached for it, but I was faster. I scanned the page, my heart hammering. Day 20, thought I heard footsteps last night. Probably another camper. Day 3. Someone moving around camp after dark. No response when I called out. Day 40, same boot prints near mine this morning. Didn't see anyone. Day 4. Later, I don't think I'm alone out here. The date on the last entry was 2 days before he was reported missing. I looked up, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. The sun was dropping fast, shadows stretching long and distorted between the trees. We still hadn't found Evan, but we had found something else instead. Evidence that whatever happened to him hadn't been sudden and hadn't been an accident. As the ranger gently took the notebook from my hands, I felt a certainty settle over me, heavy and cold. My brother hadn't just disappeared. He had been watched, followed. And whatever had been close enough to leave those tracks was still somewhere in these woods. Because the last set of footprints we'd found didn't turn back toward the trail. They continued deeper into the forest, as if expecting us to follow. We debated stopping for the night. Protocol said we should. Sunset was bleeding quickly into evening, and the temperature was already dropping. One of the rangers keyed his radio to call in our position, his voice calm and professional, but I could hear the strain beneath it. When he finished, he looked at the rest of us and said we had about 45 minutes of usable light left. After that, visibility would depend entirely on headlamps. I didn't want to stop. The idea of leaving Evan out there overnight, alone with whatever had been close enough to write itself into his notebook, felt unbearable. I argued, quietly at first, then more forcefully. The ranger listened, nodding, letting me finish. When I was done, he said something that made my chest tighten. He said that sometimes stopping was the safest way to make sure we didn't. Another missing person to the list. The tracker intervened. He pointed out that the trail we were following was unusually clear for off-trail movement, that the ground ahead showed consistent disturbance, as if someone had passed through recently. Fresh enough, he said, that stopping now might mean losing it by morning. The ranger hesitated, then agreed to push on a little longer. Just a little. We moved in single file as the light thinned. The forest changed character as dusk settled in. The birds went quiet. Insects took over, their buzzing forming a constant, uneven backdrop. Every so often, I thought I heard footsteps ahead of us, just out of sync with our own. Each time, I stopped, held my breath, and listened. Each time, there was nothing definite enough to point to. The disturbed path led us toward higher ground, weaving between dense stands of fir and pine. Evan's footprints were harder to make out now, but the tracker still managed to pick them up, along with the second set. They remained close, too close, at one point. The impressions overlapped so completely. It looked as if two people had been walking in step, one almost inside the other's stride. My thoughts kept circling back to Evan's habits. He was careful. If he thought someone was following him, he wouldn't have wandered aimlessly. He would have doubled back, changed direction, tested whether the presence was real. As if responding to that thought, the trail suddenly veered sharply to the left, then looped back toward itself. Evan had tried to circle around. The other prints followed without hesitation. By the time we reached a small clearing, night had fully arrived. The ranger called it. We set up a temporary hold, marking our position with reflective tape. The plan was to resume at first light. I protested again, but my voice sounded thin even to my own ears. Exhaustion was setting in, dragging at my limbs and my thoughts. We didn't camp. None of us wanted to. Instead, we stood in a loose cluster, headlamps cutting pale cones through the darkness, listening to the forest breathe around us. The ranger took first watch while the rest of us rested in shifts, leaning against trees or sitting on fallen logs. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Evan writing those last lines, listening to footsteps just beyond his tent. Sometime during the night, hours later, though it felt like minutes, I heard it again. A footstep. Not the crunch of an animal moving randomly through undergrowth, but the deliberate placement of weight. Heel, then toe. I opened my eyes and swept my headlamp across the trees. The beam caught nothing but trunks and shadows. I told myself it was my imagination, the result of fatigue and fear feeding off each other. Then I heard it a second time, closer. I stood, heart pounding, and walked a few steps away from the others. The ranger noticed and hissed my name under his breath, but I waved him off. I wanted to be sure. I angled my light low, scanning the ground. For a moment I saw nothing. Then the beam slid over a patch of bare soil, and my stomach dropped. There was a fresh footprint, not Evan's. The tread was different, narrower, the edges sharper. It pointed away from us, deeper into the forest. I followed it with my light, finding another. They weren't random. They formed a path that curved just beyond the reach of our lamps. I called the ranger over. He crouched, studied the print, and his jaw tightened. He asked quietly if anyone else had moved around during the night. No one had. He radioed the finding in, his tone clipped. When he finished, he looked at me and said something I won't forget. He said that whatever had followed Evan might still be aware of us. Dawn came slowly, gray light seeping between the trees. With it came a renewed urgency. We followed the fresh tracks, our pace quicker now despite the uneven ground. The trail led downhill, toward a low, lying area thick with ferns and fallen logs. The air there was damp, carrying the smell of rot and cold earth. We found Evan's jacket draped over a branch. It was zipped up, sleeves hanging limp, as if someone had removed it carefully rather than tearing it away. His phone was in one pocket. Dead. No cracks, no obvious damage. Just left behind. The tracker found scuff marks nearby, signs of a struggle that had been quickly erased by time and weather. There were no drag marks, no blood. Just disturbed leaves and broken stems radiating outward, then stopping abruptly. Evan's footprints ended there. The second set did not. They continued on, leading toward a dense stand of trees, where the light barely penetrated. I felt a surge of anger then, sharp enough to cut through the fear. Whoever had done this hadn't just taken my brother. They had taken him methodically, patiently over days. They had let him know he was being watched. We pressed on. The forest grew quieter with every step, as if sound itself were being absorbed. Even the insects seemed muted. I realized distantly that I hadn't heard birds since dawn. The ranger slowed us, signaling for caution. My pulse thudded in my ears. That was when I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Marks on the trees, higher now, at eye level. Not scratches. Handprints. Smudged with dirt, fingers splayed wide, appearing on trunk after trunk, always facing the direction we were headed, as if someone had been walking ahead of us, touching the trees as they passed. I stopped, suddenly certain of one thing. Avon hadn't been lost. He hadn't wandered into danger by mistake. He had been guided, herded. And the signs we were following weren't just remnants of the past. They were recent. The ranger called another halt. He said we were approaching a natural boundary marked on the map. A section of forest with limited access and no established trails. Beyond it, the terrain dropped sharply into a network of gullies and sinkholes. Dangerous even in daylight. I looked past him into the darkened trees ahead. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement there. A shift of shadow that didn't match the sway of branches. I blinked, and it was gone. But the certainty remained, heavy and unmistakable. Whatever had followed Evan had not finished with us yet. We crossed the boundary anyway. The ranger said it quietly, as if the forest might overhear. He radioed our position and the decision, using the same measured tone he'd used all day. But his eyes kept moving, tracking shadows between trunks. The ground changed almost immediately, sloping and uneven, riddled with shallow depressions masked by leaves. Every step felt tentative, like the forest was testing our balance, waiting for a mistake. The handprints continued. Some were faint, barely darker than the bark beneath them. Others were clear enough to show the whorl patterns of skin, the spread of fingers. They were spaced at a steady walking pace. Whoever left them wasn't running. They weren't dragging anything either. They were moving calmly, unhurried, as if confident we would follow. The second set of footprints remained visible in patches of damp soil, always leading, never overlapping ours. Evan's prints were gone now. That absence felt louder than any sound. I kept replaying his last notebook, entry in my head, the way his handwriting had tightened around the words. I don't think I'm alone out here. He had known. Not in a vague, nervous way, but with certainty. And he had kept going anyway. The tracker stopped suddenly and held up a hand. We froze. He crouched and brushed aside leaves near the edge of a shallow gully. Something pale showed beneath. At first, my heart leapt, a sharp, painful hope. Then I realized what I was looking at was fabric. It was Evan's undershirt, clean, folded, placed carefully on a flat rock just below the lip of the gully. No tears, no blood. It looked less like discarded clothing and more like an offering. I felt my knees weaken. The ranger steadied me without a word. The tracker scanned the area, his expression tight. He said this wasn't consistent with an animal encounter. He didn't say what he thought it was consistent with. The gully dropped steeply, but not impossibly so. We descended carefully, using roots and rocks for balance. At the bottom, the air felt cooler, heavier. Sound behaved strangely there, muffled and directional, as if the walls were absorbing it. The ground was soft, churned in places, then smooth again, as though someone had taken care to erase signs of passage. That was where we found the last thing that belonged to Evan. His boots stood side by side near the base of a tree, laces neatly tucked in. I recognized the chipped edge on the right heel immediately. Seeing them empty, placed with such care, did something to me. It stripped away the last thin layer of denial I'd been clinging to. The ranger knelt, examined them, then straightened. He said Evan wasn't barefoot by accident. This was intentional. He radioed again, requesting additional resources, his voice steady but urgent now. As he spoke, I noticed something else. The handprints on the trees were different here, lower, closer together, as if whoever had left them had changed posture. The forest went silent again. Not the natural quiet of animals pausing, but a deeper absence, like sound itself had been switched off. I became acutely aware of my breathing, the rasp of it loud in my own ears. The tracker's eyes widened slightly. He mouthed a single word. Listen. At first, I heard nothing. Then, faintly, a sound carried up from deeper in the gully network. Footsteps. Slow measured. Approaching. The ranger raised his hand, signaling us to hold. My heart hammered so hard I was sure it would give us away. The footsteps stopped. A long, stretched out moment passed. Then they resumed, closer now, not directly toward us but circling, testing. I realized then that this wasn't pursuit. It was inspection. The ranger called out, identifying himself, his voice firm. He asked if anyone needed help. The words echoed oddly, bouncing off the gully walls and returning distorted. There was no reply. Instead, the footsteps stopped again, followed by a sound that made my blood run cold. Breathing, not labored, not panicked. Just calm, steady breaths. Close enough that I could tell it wasn't one of ours. The tracker shifted, raising his headlamp. The beam swept across the gully, catching rock, moss, shadow. Then, for a fraction of a second, it illuminated something else. A figure stood partially concealed behind a tree, just far enough that details blurred. It was upright, human-shaped. Too still. As the light touched it, it moved, not away, but slightly to the side, as if adjusting to stay just out of full view. The ranger shouted, more forcefully this time. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped back, vanishing into the narrow channels beyond. The footsteps resumed, retreating now, unhurried. We followed. Against every instinct, every rule, we followed. The gully narrowed, branching into smaller cuts that twisted and overlapped. The handprints appeared again, now on rocks, on exposed roots, guiding us forward. My thoughts splintered, fear and grief and anger tangling together. The path ended at a shallow sinkhole, no more than 15 feet across. At its center lay a depression, filled with leaves and debris. The tracker approached carefully and parted the covering with his boot. There was nothing beneath. No body, no bones, just compacted earth, pressed flat, as if something heavy had rested there for a long time and then moved on. I broke then. The sound that came out of me didn't feel human. I dropped to my knees at the edge of the sinkhole, my hands sinking into cold soil. The ranger let me grieve for a moment before pulling me back, his grip firm. He said we were done, that this area was no longer safe. He said we would mark the location and withdraw. I wanted to argue, to dig with my bare hands if I had to, but something in his expression stopped me. He looked shaken in a way I hadn't seen before. As we turned to leave, I felt it again. That sensation of being watched. I looked back. For an instant, I saw it clearly. The figure stood at the far edge of the sinkhole, just beyond where we'd been looking. It was closer now. Close enough that I could see the outline of clothing, the suggestion of a face that wasn't quite right. Its head tilted slightly, mimicking a gesture I'd made earlier without realizing it. Then it stepped back, and the forest swallowed it. We left the boundary in silence. The sounds of the woods returned gradually. Birds, insects, the rustle of leaves. Too abruptly, as if someone had flipped a switch back on. When we reached the trailhead hours later, the sun was already sinking again, completing a full, terrible cycle of day. Evan was never found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed deceased due to environmental hazards. The notebook and boots were logged as evidence. The extra footprints, the handprints, the folded clothing, those details were noted, then quietly set aside. I joined the search to find my brother. I left knowing something else entirely. Whatever followed him didn't need to chase or attack. It waited. It walked alongside. And when Avon finally understood he couldn't outrun it, he stopped running. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints, always just offset from his own. I think about how, for days, he must have sensed a presence close enough to mirror his steps. And I wonder how long it takes for someone to realize that being followed isn't the worst part. It's being chosen.